Mayor's Housing Advisory Board, April 24th, 2019. We'll do roll call, but we have, oh, Juliet's not here. Couple new people to introduce to our team. And when we all started with the Housing Advisory Board, we all kind of did a little brief introduction too. So I'll have Juliet and Terry, if you'd want to, just say a brief hello. And if there's anything you'd like the public to kind of know about you in your introduction, and then we'll go around with the rest of the roll call.
Great. I get to start? Okay. Hello, I'm Juliet Boone. I'm new to HAB. I've lived in Boulder for 20 years. I've lived in a variety of housing in Boulder, including in co-housing, in 3 different neighborhoods. I have children who attend Boulder Public Schools and 2 at CU. So I'm excited to be part of this and give back to the community.
Hello, Terry Palmos, and let's see, I'm a native of Boulder. I was born and raised here. I've lived here all my life except for going away to school and grad school. I'm a real estate guy, so my experience in housing is on every level. Landlord, I've built housing, I rent housing, I've remodeled housing, I've sold housing, I've done just about everything you can do with respect to housing in Boulder, and I still do. So I want to thank everybody for being here.
And we'll continue with roll call. Microphone in green.
Judy Nod.
Jean Gatza with Comprehensive Planning for the city.
And Jeff Yegan with Housing and Human Services, Board Liaison.
Mike McKenzie.
Jacques Julien.
Adam Swetlick.
And Mason Moyer. Okay. Did everybody review the agenda? Any additions, changes?
Do you want to just make note of your motion that you're going to make later in the meeting?
It's actually on here.
Oh, okay, perfect. Awesome.
Thank you.
Review it.
Anybody else? Okay. And a motion to accept the agenda?
Second.
And approval of the minutes from March 20th? Motion?
Second.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to open up for public participation. Do we have anybody signed up? Nope. Fantastic. Does anybody in the audience want to speak to anything?
Well, I could introduce myself real quick.
Okay.
And then I'll go up and sign up. I asked the wrong question before. Hi there, I'm Dave Ensign. I'm from the Planning Board, and Brian Bowen couldn't be here tonight, so I'll just be sitting in the audience. He's the backup for Crystal as the ex officio. So if you have any questions, I actually missed the last Alpine Balsam Subcommunity Planning update that went to Planning Board, so this will be really useful for me to get an update tonight. So thanks for letting me attend. That's all I had.
Welcome. Thank you. Okay, we'll close the public participation and move on to matters from council.
All right, Jean.
All right. So again, I'm Jean Gatza with Comprehensive Planning, and I've seen many of you before, I think on a previous update, maybe even a year ago, when we first were kicking off the area planning process for Alpine Balsam. And at the time, I think we were taking East Bookend along with it, but we've since narrowed the scope and have been working on Alpine Balsam for a while. So my thoughts, and I'm talking this over with Jeff and understanding agenda, was we don't have any necessarily new information for the board or questions per se at the moment, but given that you've got new members and we've been down a path since the last time we met, I thought that I would talk a little bit about our process and schedule, or our sort of uncertain process and schedule at the moment, and where we might have, when and where we might have some certainty on that. A little bit about area planning, our direction from the comp plan, just to ground you guys in why we do these plans, what we're talking about doing at Alpine Balsam, and then when we come back with choices for those, what this board's role will be. if that makes sense. Okay, so we were anticipating bringing draft plan components and choices and all of the analysis to our planning board and city council in late May and early June. And we are still working on that. We might be doing that, but our council has raised some questions about some costs related to the Alpine Balsam site and the deconstruction of the hospital, and some of the future options of what that might look like that might have an impact on what we're doing with the area plan. So we have, the council has a special meeting on May 16th to talk about those items, and that may shift where we're going with the area plan. So I'm hoping that we'll know a little bit more about dates and process next week, whether that's going to be June or whether that might be later in the summer. And then we'll know a little bit more after the special meeting on the 16th. So as soon as we know more, we will have information on the Alpine Balsam Project website. I'm going to pass around these cards that are specific to that. It's really easy to find on the city's website if you just enter Alpine Balsam. So with that, I gave you some handouts because we always go back to our Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan that was updated in 2000. We started the update in 2015, and we finished it in 2017. So we've got a couple of excerpts, and actually I brought lots of props tonight, so I can pass these around too if folks want to browse through them. There is a bouldervalleycomplan.net, and it's available on the city website too, of our plan. What I've provided is both the subcommunity and area planning section, as well as the housing policies that Jeff knows well because you helped with the update. So with subcommunity and area planning, what we do, the comp plan provides direction that when there's a significant change or an area of opportunity in the community, it's good to do an area plan so that we reevaluate the land uses, the character, the urban design, the access and mobility, all the transportation connections, improvements, so that we can plan ahead and know what those uses are going to be, how that affects our projections, how we can best implement Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan policies in that area, and serve it. I mean, we assess all of the facilities and services, transportation being a big one, utilities being a big one, police, fire. We talk to the school district, all those things when we're looking at potential changes in any part of the community. So you can take a look at what this direction is. It's really about a future vision of an area, appropriate density, character, scale, mix of uses, and then identifying the regulatory changes that would be needed to encourage and promote those visions. You can look through all the rest of this, but that's our direction from the comp plan. There's a little section on area planning, and that's why we do these plans. And I just gave you the housing policies so that you can have these handy always for your discussions and your future work. So with that, so what is this area planning? How does this manifest? One of the more recent bigger ones that we did is the Transit Village Area Plan. It's a significantly larger area than what we're looking at for Alpine Balsam. So quite a lot more significant potential for redevelopment. And so if you want to just browse, this is where we're heading. It'll be different. Alpine Balsam will look different. The plan will look different, but it'll have most of the same components: land use, urban design and character, access and mobility, connections planning, and then facilities and services. And then we adopted also an implementation plan that went with it that then we reevaluate very frequently, that steps out all of, we got to change zoning, and here's how we're going to do it. And we've got to, all of the regulatory pieces, all of the funding pieces, because those are really big too, especially for a plan of that size that included so many improvements, infrastructure and other improvements. So,
Quick question. How long did that plan take?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of these plans, there's, like there'll be some work. I know that we did some work in that area in a comp plan update, and then the plan itself took hold. I don't honestly, I don't remember. I think it was about a year and a half.
And just a reminder, you have to wait to be acknowledged
sorry.
by the chair.
You got it.
Okay. So Alpine Balsam. So, I'm sure this is harder to see, but I know many of you have seen this map before. While we have, the impetus for, thank you, Jeff. The impetus for this area plan is the sale of the Boulder Community Hospital to the city, and their vacating of that property. And so we have a really important opportunity and investment for redevelopment right in the heart of our downtown Boulder corridor and our Central Broadway corridor. And as I said, when we look at this, we don't look at just that site. We need to look at the areas all around that to ensure that we are looking at all potential impacts, looking at all potential opportunities, and to really assess what this area's vision is for the future and put the right mechanisms in place to achieve that. With that, this one is a little different because the city is the property owner of a significant redevelopment of site. We, in 2000, so right after the sale of the property, 2015, the city embarked on the vision plan process. So that was really at what are all the big ideas? How do we take all the big ideas and put them into one plan to help guide the next steps for this work? In May of last year, we started the area planning process, and that process is to take what's on the vision plan and actually do some more feasibility testing, get more real about what that vision plan contained and try to really understand what does it mean for different site designs and site opportunities. We developed a number of scenarios that had around a number of key questions around uses, density and building heights, flood mitigation, and access and mobility that we talked with the community about last fall. We got direction from our planning board and our council. We did some more revisions to those and checked back in with our planning board and council in February. Also we did a series of small group community workshops to really focus in about the wider area and to ask questions about land uses and opportunities and thoughts. We had a lot of good questions about access and mobility, transportation at those workshops as well, and we learned a lot. Fabulous conversations with community members. We do have an existing conditions report that we shared at those, sorry, Jeff, I'm making you move around. At those meetings, I will say this is draft. We're still, it's all the right information. We're just making some revisions to make it a little more readable and summarize some things in a better way. So we've taken a lot of that feedback. We are in the analysis stage. We're doing a lot of analysis and anticipating having land use and urban design choices for the area, as well as all of our supporting documentation, connections planning, potential improvements, back for community feedback and review at our next stage, whenever that may be, hopefully this summer. Let's see, what else? A few of you participated in a couple of joint board workshops, both in the fall and earlier this year, with several members of several other boards, and they were structured similar to the community engagement that we had, and some really nice discussions with us through those. So, moving forward, as I mentioned, we will be bringing forth the framework of the area plan with a lot of choices. So pieces that might then translate into the plan, and we want to get board and community feedback when we do have those for you. This board, as well as the Transportation Advisory Board, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, and the Design Advisory Board will be asked to provide recommendation to council, Planning Board and Council, and who are the adopters of the plan. And then the staff will be taking all of those recommendations and developing a draft plan. So that's our process and your role coming up. Any questions at this point? So,
Yeah, so I'll just remind everybody that at the last meeting, we voted for a very formal motion towards stronger Roberts rules. So if anybody during the meeting wants to bring up any questions, waiting until the chair recognizes you, and again, following more formal Roberts rules. So if anybody does have any questions as of right now. Judy?
So is this the board discussion part, or is this just questions, and then we're going to have a board discussion about it in general?
I'd say dive right in, see how the conversation goes.
If you have something you'd like to discuss.
I do. So it's probably no secret to everyone that my interest in housing in Boulder is about finding that sweet spot between maintaining neighborhood character and providing as much affordability as possible. And like everyone else in this room, I've been studying this issue as much as possible and was confused about some things, and Jean has really helped me. She knows I keep emailing her questions. And my feeling about the Alpine Balsam project at this point is that I want to make sure I know where we're starting before we as a city can decide where we want to go. And the questions I had for her is, what is the current zoning? Obviously, the site that was purchased is public, but what's the current zoning around it, and how many units per acre? Because that'll help me conceptualize if it's approaching that sweet spot of not changing neighborhood character, but also providing as much affordable housing as possible. So, Jean showed me where I could find these things, and I couldn't find them on my own. They were just hard to find. So I printed out what the zoning looks like on the map and want to pass it out. And I also printed out what the units per acre are per each of those zoning things in the area. And that really helped me understand. I also asked Jean what she thought approximately was the amount of acreage that would be devoted towards housing, and you said around 5-ish. Is that right, would you say?
yep, the city-owned, the site, the full site is about 8.8 acres, and that includes the Brenton building and the parking garage. And if we just are thinking about, and our direction had been that we would be moving forward to at least continue exploring renovating the medical pavilion for the new city service center hub. So some of that would be city services and not housing. If you leave the rest of the city-owned site, minus about 30 to 40% for infrastructure and open space, you get somewhere between 3 and 5 acres.
May I continue, Madam Chair? Yeah, okay, thanks. So when I looked at all these different zoning options and how many units per acre, again, as I've already mentioned this to Jean before, there is a precedent at 3303 Broadway, although that hasn't been taken up by the developers yet, but the land use was changed so that it could be RMX2, which would mean that there could be 10 units per acre, but if there was permanently affordable housing, there could be 10 more units per acre. So there could be 10 units that were not permanently affordable, but 10 units deemed permanently affordable. And that, in the neighborhood around 3303 Broadway, which is the neighborhood I live in, made the neighbors feel fine that the character, it maintained the character of the neighborhood. It would increase the density considerably, but not outrageously. And something like that, if you look at the map, you see that most of the area around the site are single-family homes, although there are some other things right around it. So to me, I just wanted to put that out as a possibility for us to consider at some point, because to me, that seems a really good way of maintaining neighborhood character and providing affordable housing. And in a large survey that the city did a couple years ago, the top two most important things to people, residents in the city of Boulder, were more affordability on housing and also maintaining neighborhood character. So those are both real important issues in the city. So I just wanted to say, I just wanted to come out and tell you, I'm sure you know how I feel, but I wanted to state it at a meeting, that I'm for something like that, that would be that 10 units plus 10 more for permanently affordable, I think would be a nice way to go, of mixed types, so that there could be singles, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom, so you could get all the groups of people that we say, recognize need more housing in Boulder, and also have some accessibility to some of the units, so people with disabilities. So I just wanted to state where my interest was and where I was about that. Thank you.
Michael?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The question I have, two questions. One is if we had it to do over again, to spend, was it $42 million? Is that roughly the number? Would we? And the other is a consideration to sell Alpine Balsam as it is to a commercial developer. Is that a possibility?
Well, okay, and I'll answer this, and then actually, I think Jeff had a suggestion that I want to circle back about how, Judy, maybe your recommendations fit into the area planning process. Our council will be taking up those questions. Not something I can answer at this point. There are a range of different costs for purchase, interest, potential for hospital deconstruction, and other infrastructure, that we have different levels of potential for. There's always the intention to sell part of the site for other future uses, housing being one of them, as the city is not a housing developer. So at different places of readiness, there are different ways they will affect the land costs and the land prices. So not something that I can speak to at this point, but I would suggest that folks tune into the May 16th special meeting to learn more about those.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, good point. Judy, so I think that your suggestions make sense, and as we move forward, we'll be looking at the potential land uses for both, and options for land uses on the site, as well as taking a look at the land uses in the area. There are a number of different housing land uses in different areas within the area plan. There's the mixed density, high density, and some mixed use, both business and residential, as well as other non-residential land uses in the area. And so we're going to be, at least we're anticipating, floating some options on those, and there'll be some ranges because there are different ways to achieve different goals.
And Jean, you'll have to correct me if I speak out of turn here, but it's entirely possible that there would be an Alpine Balsam area plan completed even if the city were to sell the property, as has been suggested. So they are linked but not dependent on each other. I think we would probably not do any project on the site without an area plan. Is that a fair summary?
I think so, because currently the land use on the site and the zoning is public. It's for a public institutional use, and it's very limited within our regulations as to what can happen underneath that, with that. So, we want the best possible outcome for the redevelopment of this site that serves community values, and we're going to have to address land use and zoning and character and all of the other things that we typically do in an area plan for whatever future this is.
Anyone else? Okay.
If I may just note for the public that there are 2 members of the Housing Advisory Board that have attended joint board and commission work group for Alpine Balsam, and I assume that format will continue to be used for board and commission input, or are we wrapping that up?
I think we're back, I think at this point we are to, we'll be back to the full board for recommendations. You know, we and this may be something that we talk about.
It's a possibility that your work is done, and it's a possibility that it's not.
The work will not, yeah.
I mentioned that because the board has a project liaison role, and that may be wrapping up, or it may not, it sounds like. So,
Yeah, that's correct.
Adam?
So that begs the question, do you think we'll have any input on area planning in the future?
Well, we'll definitely be bringing the choices and the potential plan components to this board for a recommendation to the planning board and council. I would imagine also that you would have a similar role for the East Boulder subcommunity plan that is underway. I think Kathleen was here she was here last month?
So you've had a introduction to subcommunity planning project, and I believe it's scheduled to come back in June for the next step on that. But as each plan moves forward, to the extent that I think all of our subcommunities have a housing component, there will likely be housing issues you'll be asked to weigh in on.
Okay, great. Anybody else? Thank you.
So I can leave all the props, all of those plans, and Jeff can collect those if you just want to look over those through the meeting.
Okay,
That
thank
makes
you.
sense.
Yep, he's in the kitchen.
So I'm curious with our board, one of the reasons why we're in this format is to potentially have future issues brought up and structured this way so that we could have a more informal discussion around larger projects as a way to facilitate more, a less adversarial and more conversational as we move through, again, a big project such as Alpine Balsam. So a part of me is just kind of curious if we want to talk about process. How does this feel in this situation? Do we want to discuss like if this is, or do we just want to wrap it up and keep going? Adam?
So I really like, especially if we do have public participation, the ability for them to sit down with us. I think that just physical barrier is really reduced compared to, I think several of us have testified at council before, and it's an intimidating process having to be up there. So I like this current format, and like you said, I think this is just a really good way to sort of get the feel of it. And personally, from just sitting down here, I've liked the feel of it so far. So if we have a really engagement-heavy type item, I wouldn't mind doing this in the future.
Jack?
I would say that for kind of general process of the board, if it's not public engagement heavy, it seems a little bit more cumbersome in some ways. But I totally agree also, like, you know, if someone from the public is coming down, it's just really nice to be able to bring them into the circle a little bit. So.
Yeah, originally we were hoping that Alpine Balsam we were just going to be launching this whole thing, and we were going to really have in-depth, robust conversations and really invite the public to participate, and then it kind of all fell apart a council meeting or two ago. And but that was the hope, was that how do we soften the edges a little bit? I would even recommend that during this time if there's a way to suspend even more of the formality of Robert's rules while we're talking with public so that it doesn't feel as formal for them to participate. Finding a way that if we truly are going to have a discussion, that it be a discussion. Anybody else want to talk about a way of softening the position for? Yes, Adam.
I definitely agree. And a temporary suspension of the rules is a pretty easy thing to do. So in the future, I would suggest that for sure. I second your sentiment exactly.
Okay. Yes.
So forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, but this is being my first meeting. What length of time would the public be engaging in a format like this? Is it just the 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting, or is it the entire meeting?
So I think Adam can probably speak more to about this format, but we're brand new to trying something like this, and the engagement committee, I think, weren't you guys the original ones that brought forth, let's try and do a different format and structure, so maybe you want to speak to it a little bit more?
Sure. So the basis is still the public participation rules that we have with pooling and everything, pooling of time. So you would, in most cases, still only be given 3 minutes, but we're kind of willing to ask a lot more questions than would normally happen at, say, a council meeting, or let people go over a little bit if they're trying to, present a really, really big thing. So it's just a little looser than your average council meeting. Obviously, if things get a little out of hand or something, we always have the rules to fall back on, but we really wanted to just allow a little bit more open communication, and a lot more back and forth, especially.
That makes sense. Michael?
I works either way. My only thought is the two tables here, if I put myself in the role of the public, would be a little more engaging to not have a table between us and the audience for those two tables. I like the formality of up there. I never felt uncomfortable going up in front of council and that, but I respect the fact that some people may find that intimidating.
Julia?
With respect to the rules, my concern would be, how do we create an environment that's fair for everyone if we're bending the rules for some people and then deciding if things get out of hand that enough is enough and we have to go back. I think to be fair to all the other boards and commissions, my recommendation would be to stick with the rules as they are and not bend them for additional public time. We just stick with what the standard is for public engagement in a process. But again, being new, that's my initial reaction to it.
How often do we get public comment? Historically?
It depends, I think, on the topic. There's times where we've definitely had more people show up, but I think part of the engagement committee was making sure that we'd like to see this audience packed. We'd like to be able to see that everybody's coming in and talking about housing, and that we become a space where people want to show up here and engage as a part of the process of headed to the council.
But, okay, that sounds great, but how many, on average, how many people are here in a meeting from the public? 1, 5, 10?
Maybe 1 to 5.
1 to 5, okay.
Judy?
And to further develop that a little bit, when we've had special topics, we've had as many as 40, I think. And then, of course, to answer your question, with each person just getting 3 minutes each, that's already a lot of time. So the meetings last longer on those days, and we've only had that happen, like at our meeting about ADUs, there were a lot of people there, and they all got to talk. I will say that the interactive nature, when we ask lots of questions and let people maybe talk a little bit longer, I think has really done well for us. It seems that we've gotten some really nice notes from people who say this is the one place where they feel they can be heard. And I think that's something we take seriously, is that engagement aspect.
Anybody else? Jeff?
Just if I may suggest that you could establish a set of rules for a particular discussion that apply equally to everyone. So if you, and you would want to let the public know that, but if you wanted to give people more time, you would probably want to give everybody the same opportunity. So you could say, for this topic, on our public hearing, we're allowing public comment of up to 5 minutes per person. And then that you would probably want to decide that as a group as part of your process discussions.
Right. So that brings up a good point that maybe around, as we develop our processes, period, maybe what we do around listening sessions or this being a roundtable, that we set up, what does a roundtable process look like? The tables are set up this way, engagement is this amount of time for each person. A listening session is this, and it looks like that. So maybe that's something to put on the, whoever continues with engagement, something to consider for a process. Judy?
I also want to mention, you probably already know this, and I'm sorry if I'm saying something you already know, but there's the open comment section at the beginning, and that's not what we're talking about now. I don't think we're talking about if there's a public hearing where we actually make a recommendation, or the listening sessions that we're starting that we've never done before. So that's the one we're a little more vague on.
Jacques?
Yeah, just a little clarification for me. Maybe this is directed to you, Jeff, mostly. It appears to me that the normal process of allotting time, the 3 minutes, and then boards and council are welcome to ask questions above and beyond that time. At least I observe that happening regularly. So that seems to me that essentially, I mean, it seems like it serves the purpose as it works currently. If you pool time, if a number of people come in, they want to pool time because they need more for a significant presentation. I mean, I don't know, I'm not seeing what we're trying to define
Right.
otherwise.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that while you were talking about that. To be clear, we're talking about something different than public participation that occurs in the beginning of the meetings. We're talking about what we've voted on the last couple of meetings, and what we've talked about with the engagement committee is if they have these educational seminars, which is in our packets, the things we've been talking about for the last 2 months, that these would look differently. So the listening session, that's why we pulled ourselves down here. How do we soften the edges? What is it? So that process is slightly different than the public participation, which is the more formal piece of it, that structure and our meetings will always remain the same. This is just for these different pieces. Does that make sense? These are different sessions. Kind of like when the city council does a study session, it's a different type of meeting versus their formal council meeting. Does that make sense? Am I
Yeah,
Okay.
I suppose I'm still trying to understand why the time structures couldn't still apply.
Oh,
Even though
that's-
if we shift the physical structure of the meeting,
Yep.
but that those time, because I do also have concerns, as Juliet said, that, you know, how do we keep a balanced condition and a set of rules that everybody understands coming in?
Does the engagement committee want to address that?
Yeah, I think one way that would help that, thank you, one way that would help that really work is, sure, we can keep it to 3 minutes, but by asking lots of questions, the person then has the right to speak some more. So we can just be more interactive about asking questions. I'm just wanting a more interactive exchange, is what I was talking about, Adam? Or, yeah.
Adam?
Yeah, I'm right on board with that. It's just supposed to be more of a conversation than we are normally capable of doing in these types of meetings.
Any other questions? Jeff?
I'll just say, I think what's important is that you have agreement amongst yourselves, however you want to do that, on how it will run in a particular situation, and that everyone is treated, given the same opportunity. So whether that is, this will be completely open, whoever shows up, we can go, you know, back and forth as much as we want at any point in the meeting. If you guys agree to that and everyone has the same chance, fine. If you wanted to stick to I think you would probably, because you're required to have give the public the opportunity, if you start cutting back on the standard, you want to do so rarely and only for really good reasons. But expanding it is within your purview, I would say.
So for that next meeting in May, I guess the question out to everybody is, do we feel clear on what that process is? Michael?
From my observation, and I haven't been here the whole time, is we don't have an audience participation problem. We don't have an audience participation. We don't know what the process is because we haven't really had enough experience to know what process would be appropriate. And so why not try and drive audience participation and attendance? I think one measure or benchmark might be, and I say this humorously, if we get to the point where we would consider charging a cover, we know we have a lot of people. And that, but short of that, we don't know. And you can always change the process to say, we tried this 5-minute thing and we wanted to be equitable with people. And you can say, that didn't really work because we ended up going till midnight. You can change it and modify it as we learn and as the board learns how to deal with that participation. But it would seem like the first one is just having people here.
Thank you. Anybody else? Jacques?
I mean, I think kind of along those same lines, I feel like for these specific engagement pieces that we're talking about coming into this type of a format, that we would just stick with the time. My suggestion would be we just stick with the time rules as they are. We modify the physical format, maintain the time format, and let's see how that plays out. And if we find a problem with that, then we could come back to it and adjust it.
Adam, you want to add anything?
So, yeah, that's absolutely, I think, what we're going for. I just want everyone to really get into the conversation a little bit when we're having people come to us, especially when they're telling us stories that impact their personal lives. Like, it's much more about the emotion to me than maybe about the specific rules. It's how we approach it as the board, and how receptive we are to hearing people come out and tell us their personal stories. So that's sort of what the core of this is all about. Much less, if someone wants to go the extra 30 seconds because they're telling an emotional moment, I think that's pretty important that we allow that. And we've seen that at council very recently too, so it happens.
Thank you. Jeff?
I'm just remembering an element of the conversation that you've had before that I think you should decide about, which is, as I remember it, you had wanted after, typically even with questions and answers, once the initial back and forth is done, the person returns to the audience and that's that. I remember someone expressing a desire to have the ability 20, 30 minutes later to go back to that person and say, well, what about this? What do you think about that? So if you want to incorporate that element, you should probably be clear about what expectations are amongst yourselves for managing that and therefore being able to share that with the public.
Adam?
So that might be sort of 2.0 version, just because I don't think we have a solid process for that in place for the next meeting, and I wouldn't want to get into that right now. But that's the aspiration, that we could do that at some point. It's just the fairness of that is really, really sort of a thing we'd have to mull over.
Yeah, I think the hope is that we could get these to, like Michael had said, like we just get the people in the seats and wanting to participate, and then from there, we can start to see what we need to have, since it's a new process for any board to participate in something like this. And that's my personal thought on it. And does anybody else have any, before we close this discussion and move on to the next? No? Okay. So we'll go on to surveys of HOA managers.
Good evening.
Hello.
So I'm going to speak from back here because we can't quite get the dais to work. So my name is Jay Sugnitz. I'm a senior planner with Housing and Human Services. I've been here with have before to talk about the accessory dwelling unit update, but for the new folks, welcome. So why are we doing this survey? Existing or the veteran advisory board members or members, the city has heard quite a few concerns from owners of our affordable homes that HOA dues in particular and fees are causing their homes to become less affordable over time. So what we wanted to do was to conduct a survey. Actually, we did two, and David's going to talk about both of them, to see how extensive is that issue and try to understand it a little bit better before we tried to figure out what some potential solutions are. So this is sort of a sneak preview, I would say, for you guys. David sent me an email last night after midnight, so this is all sort of hot off the presses. Staff hasn't really had time to digest it. So what we're trying to do is just give you a glimpse of what to expect in terms of more detailed analysis. And we also, part of the reason was we wanted to keep it open for as many people to participate as possible. So we actually got our last survey Saturday. And then there may be some additional analysis that will be required to do a deeper dive. We'll have to see about that. But any thoughts, impressions, feedback that you might have would be greatly appreciated as we try to figure out some next steps. Does that sound good? Any questions about that before I turn it over to David Becker with RRC? Yes, Judy.
When you're done and happy with how it is, can we be emailed a copy?
Of course.
Thank you.
Yes. And I have printed versions of the PowerPoint that I'll share. And
We're going to
I'll
really have to
advance.
work on that city and paper thing.
I only did some.
It's like a tree, a meeting.
Okay, well, as Jay said, my name is Dave Becker with RRC Associates here in Boulder. We're a market research firm that has a kind of a specialization in affordable housing. We do a lot of work regarding affordable housing, particularly in mountain resort communities in Colorado, as well as working with the city on selected projects. There were two surveys that were done. The first one we'll talk about is this affordable homeowner survey. And this, our outline, just quickly go through the methodology of respondent housing demographic characteristics, satisfaction with housing, home purchase decision factors, financial security and housing costs, and a summary at the end. So with regards to the methodology, essentially we had both mail lists and an email list for all the homeowners, the 727 affordable homeowners in the city. So we first mailed out a survey, and that happened in early March. And then we followed up with 2 email follow-ups with a subsample of that group. We had emails for about, I believe it's 672 or so homeowners. So between having those 2 different means of outreach, we were able to get a very significant response. The response rate was about 52.8%, or 384 of the 727 homeowners. Exceptionally strong. It probably speaks mostly to respondents' interest in the subject and, you know, having a lot of opinions that they wanted to share. Confidence interval plus or minus 9 percentage points. So important just to keep in mind kind of the general patterns in the results rather than necessarily the exact precise point numbers. And I'm going kind of quickly here, but just quickly run through some of the housing and demographic characteristics of respondents. All the graphs are kind of have this kind of format where the first column shows the overall results, and then the next 3 columns break out the results by respondents' overall satisfaction with their unit. And 10% of respondents were dissatisfied or neutral with regards to their unit satisfaction. 34% were somewhat satisfied, and a majority of 57% were very satisfied. And for some of the variables, you can see that there's going to be big differences between these groups. But focusing primarily on the overall in this discussion, you can see the unit type mix where 57% are in condos, 22% in townhouses, 20% in single-family homes. With regards to, we can go to the next one, sorry, no problem. Unit size, you can see the distribution in terms of number of bedrooms where most
Excuse me,
units
can we
are-
ask a question?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. On your previous slide, just so I understand correctly, if we look at, for example, condo owners.
Sure.
And we go over to the column that says very satisfied,
Yep.
57%, that's overall. Is the 55% of, can you explain what the
Sure.
numbers are on the
Yeah,
right?
so essentially that means of that subset of people who are very satisfied with their unit, 55% of them live in condos, 20% live in townhomes, 22% live in single-family homes. And that's relatively similar to the overall average. So there's, I think, a way to sort of kind of, when you're looking at these breakouts by satisfaction, it's probably most useful to look at the rows and look at differences between, particularly, for instance, looking at the single-family home line, where of those who are dissatisfied or neutral, 9% of those folks are in single-family homes. If we compare that to the last column, it's 23% are of those who are very satisfied live in single-family homes. Essentially what this means is people who are living in single-family homes are more likely to be satisfied with their unit than, for instance, condos, where it's the opposite pattern, where you've got, I'm having trouble reading the numbers here, so I'll just look at my copy.
Yeah, it's, I mean, for me, I'm not getting any column that's adding up, and I am blonde, so I'm
Okay.
okay with not
Well,
making it all
so
connect,
each
but-
column, that's a great point. So each column sums to 100%. So if you think of, if you sort of divide up the world into these three buckets of satisfaction, that first bucket is people who are, relatively dissatisfied with their home, and they're 10% of the entire population who responded. That next group is people who are somewhat satisfied. They're 34% of the total, and that column again sums to 100%. So, and then finally 57% in that very satisfied bucket. So, so this is just, I think when we look at some other graphs, well, a reverse way of looking at this would be, what's the satisfaction of people who live in condos? It's not, the data's not formatted that way. We have run that, and I can get you those numbers. But I would primarily look at this in terms of trying to understand what are the characteristics of people who are satisfied versus dissatisfied.
Right, and I think it's super interesting that you just said the people in single-family homes are more likely to be satisfied with their housing situation than people in condos.
Correct,
That's
correct.
Okay, and you have more specific data around that?
Sure, actually, let me just look
If it's
here.
in here already,
Okay,
I will be patient and wait until
Okay.
we get to that. Thank you.
yeah, no problem. As long as we're on that subject, I can just quickly look it up. So of those who are in single-family homes, 67% are very satisfied, and that compares to 54 to 55% of those in townhouses and condos. So somewhat more are very satisfied. Somewhat more residents of single-family homes are very satisfied.
Dave, thank you. Could you offer an example of what the other is? I realize it's very small, but
Yeah, good question.
Tent.
Yeah.
I was thinking yurt, but I wasn't.
Right, and I unfortunately don't have an answer. I should look it up, but yeah.
It's de minimis. It's not.
Yeah.
I'm just
yeah,
curiosity.
true. Yeah, okay. Could have been carriage house, but I'm not sure.
And can you break down between condo and townhouse what the very satisfied?
Sure.
I think you gave a number, but it
Okay.
was together.
Okay, So actually, for,
It's further in the information. We can feel free to skip and just
Okay.
tell us to pause and,
well, we actually haven't broken it out that way
Okay.
in this presentation, but it's of those in townhouses and duplexes, 54% very satisfied. Of those in condos, 55% very satisfied. So a statistically insignificant difference, essentially the same.
Thank
Sure,
you.
Sure. Okay. So, yeah, with regards to unit size, you can see the mix of most folks in having 1 to 3 bedrooms with a majority in 2 bedrooms. And then with regards to bathrooms, most in units with 1 to 2 bathrooms, 79% in units with 1 to 2 bathrooms, 93% in units with 1 to 3 bedrooms. Okay.
So if I could add just, if we want to get through all this in a reasonable amount of time, we're going to have to move a lot quicker. There's a lot of information, and maybe it might be helpful to get through it and then go back and identify areas where you might think that we should do a little bit more digging. And my computer's going to restart in 27 minutes, so.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, yeah, I think a lot of this information that we're going through in terms of housing and demographic characteristics, I mean, I think it's in part to sort of understand the profile of owners. In part, it's to understand, are these characteristics associated with satisfaction with the units? And that's sort of another level of analysis that we'll be getting into and kind of after this meeting primarily. But with regards to location of home, you can see a wide diversity of different complexes led by Dakota Ridge at 11%, long tail of smaller developments. With regards to age, a pretty broad distribution between 25 and 74 plus, so really the whole spectrum in the affordable homeowner stock. Also a pretty wide distribution of household incomes. The overall median household income was about $56,000, average income about $61,000. And with regards to ethnicity, 3% identified as Hispanic, and roughly 10% as an ethnic or a racial minority. And 12% have somebody in the household with a long-term disability. And also looking at the composition of people in the household, you can see at the top the number of people in the household, where you've got 42% of respondents being a single-person household, 58% having 2 or more people, so kind of a skew towards relatively small households overall. With regards to employment, there were, I believe it's about 87% of households have 1 or more workers in the household. Moving down, 13% have 1 or more retirees in the household. And then finally at the bottom, 35% have kids age 17 or under in the household. And then with regards to time in the Boulder Valley, so first we've got how long have you lived in your current residence? And again, a pretty broad distribution, mostly between 1 and 20 years, 90% of people in those 3 categories. How long have you lived in the Boulder Valley? Typically somewhat longer than they lived in their unit, with, let's see here, 73% having lived in the Boulder Valley for 10 or more years. And then how much longer do you plan to live in the Boulder Valley at the bottom? And most folks planning to be here for quite a while, 79% planning to be here for 10 or more years. So kind of a long-term commitment to the community for most folks. So moving to housing satisfaction, this first graph looks at that overall satisfaction with the unit. And again, 57% very satisfied, 34% somewhat satisfied. So, you know, on its face, that suggests the program is by and large, meeting a key objective insofar as most residents are, exhibit satisfaction. When we, on the next slide, when we look at satisfaction with particular attributes of the unit, there's a variety of different locational aspects as well as size, layout, design aspects included in this list here. And, you can probably too many to go through over in detail here, but generally locational aspects have rise to the top. Bike path and trail access, 75% very satisfied with that. 74% very satisfied with the location of the home. 65% very satisfied with proximity to open space. At the bottom is storage space, where 34% are very or somewhat dissatisfied. Sound levels, 22% are somewhat or very dissatisfied with that. So kind of another summary measure of satisfaction is, are you glad you purchased your unit, and would you do it again if you had the chance for a do-over? And you can see that 89% would do it again, and 11% would not. So overall, probably another sign that, by and large, people are appreciative and glad that with their decision to have purchased. When you look at why people feel the way they do, in terms of people who said they would purchase again, a lot of the comments were just, expressed a lot of gratefulness for the program and appreciated the ability to stay in Boulder, pride of ownership, less stress in their lives, an ability to sort of have life changes like changing a career or having a child that they wouldn't have been able to experience otherwise. Also happy that, able to escape the rental market and rising and unpredictable rental costs and turnover of leases and so forth. In that 11% of folks who wouldn't purchase again, some of the themes there were the fact that appreciation was capped and that, they were therefore not able to keep up with the rapid appreciation in the free market, and therefore they couldn't make a leap to the free market, and they felt a little trapped. Some folks talked about that. Some folks talked about dissatisfaction with their particular unit, be it the size or the configuration or some other design characteristic. In some instances, poor construction, which led to problems. And then HOA costs, rising costs, sometimes being an issue. With regards to, have there been any surprises to you as a homeowner? And about 50-50 split, 49% yes. And probably the big issue among those who did experience surprises were high and particularly increasing HOA costs. I think there was also a lot of the same themes repeated from the earlier graph, so concerns about unit quality and particularly with initial construction, lack of appreciation, those kinds of concerns. And both on this slide and on the previous slide, you can see big differences between the different satisfaction groups, where in this case, 91% of those who were dissatisfied were surprised about some aspect of their purchase. And 91% versus only 38% of those who were very satisfied experienced a surprise. Another measure to some degree of satisfaction is, do you anticipate moving out of your unit within the next 5 years? And most folks do not. 57% anticipate staying for 5 years. 31% are unsure, and 12% do plan to move out. And if we just look at those yeses and babies in the second question, what are the main reasons you move or plan to move? You can see the biggest reason is live in a larger home at 45%, prefer a detached home, 35%, change in family or personal situation at 35%, want to buy a market rate unit, 24%, and so forth down the line. So moving to the next sort of topic area, we looked at factors driving the home purchase decision. And we asked this in a couple of ways. First was which items were important in your decision to purchase. And this is the same list of items where we also asked people to rate their satisfaction. You can see the top item is overall cost of the home at 80%, followed by location of the home at 76%, size of home at 62%, and progressively less below that. And then the second way we asked this question was what were the most important and second most important factors. So the next graph illustrates the single most important factor in the decision to purchase. Overall cost of the home, clearly the leader at 53%, followed by location, 20%, size of home, 11%, and relatively smaller shares focused on other attributes. We also asked a couple of questions with regards to the importance of being in Boulder and the importance of owning in your decision to purchase when you were looking for your home. The top graph shows that 69% said that it was extremely important for their home to be located in the city of Boulder when they were in their search process. And then the bottom one shows that 81% said it was extremely important for them to be able to buy. So it appears as if both of those characteristics are critical. It's not just they're in Boulder because this is the only, they don't care about being in Boulder and they're taking advantage of the homeownership program, but they really want to be here, or at least most folks do. And similarly, on the buying side, they also want to own their own unit. So there are also some questions regarding sense of financial security and how that ties in with housing costs. Top question was overall, how do you feel about your current financial situation? You can see that 17% were not at all secure or not too secure, and 83% were either somewhat secure at 58% or very secure at 27%. So I think this is probably a sensitive issue for plenty of people, and relatively few very secure. A lot of people somewhat are insecure. And then the second question, how has your sense of financial security changed since you purchased your home? 68%, or about 2/3, said their sense of financial security has improved significantly or improved slightly. So that clearly seemed to be a positive result of the program. Conversely, 17% say no change, and 14% declined slightly or significantly. When asked about what factors have sort of influenced whether their sense of financial security has either improved or declined, many people, in addition to citing there's pros and cons on the housing program side, positive being, relatively fixed mortgage costs, and escaping the rental market, which was often much more expensive than the home they moved into when they moved into ownership. As well as in the rental market, ongoing increases, which at least for many folks, were sort of halted when they moved into ownership, at least to some degree. Conversely, on the flip side, some folks also said increasing HOA costs, both in terms of assessments and dues, were a factor that impacted or had negative impacts on their sense of financial security. And then independent of their housing situation, many also acknowledged other life changes as affecting their housing situation, either getting married and having 2 income earners, getting Social Security, having a kid, or the kid moving outside of the home, developing a disability, various factors that influenced that sense of financial security. So moving on to kind of housing cost expectations. We had a question, how have your housing costs been more, less, or about the same as you expected for these 4 items? And maybe if we focus on the bottom, HOA dues and assessments, you can see that 32% said that HOA fees and assessments were much more than they expected, and 33% said they were somewhat more. So altogether, 65% said HOA fees and assessments were more than they expected. Much less folks had low expectations, or their costs have been higher than expected for maintenance and repairs. That's 29% say costs have been somewhat or much more than expected. For utilities, 25% say costs have been somewhat or much more than expected. And then for the mortgage payment, only 7% say costs have been more than expected. So that is clearly the most predictable and anticipated cost. With regards to HOA costs in particular, first question, are you your home part of a homeowners association? 95% are in an HOA. Second, if you belong to an HOA, what are your current monthly dues? You can see most folks are between the 100 and 400 range. The overall average was $241. The median was also $241. And then finally, at the end, in the time you've owned your home, have there been any lump sum special assessments? 52% said there had been assessments. And then moving on to the next graph, looking at the ratio of selected monthly owner cost to income. So this is looking at mortgage, HOA dues, and utilities altogether as a ratio to income. You can see that homeowners kind of fall across the spectrum with most in sort of the 10 to 19 and 20 to 29% of income going to those housing costs. Kind of a typical benchmark or rule of thumb is when housing costs exceed 30% of income, that is associated or often termed a cost burden, and 36% of owners kind of are experiencing those cost burdens. And arguably that's probably a little understated insofar as HOA assessments and other repairs are excluded from that. There's various ways, that in terms of items that might be calculated in those in that housing cost figure. So just to sort of recap, I think some of the main highlights from the survey, many positive indicators of satisfaction with, in terms of 57% very satisfied and 34% somewhat satisfied with their home. 89% glad they purchased and would do it again. 68% with improved financial security since they purchased. Most planning to stay for at least 5 years, 57%, and another 31% maybe. And then also just qualitatively in comments, many, expressing gratefulness and appreciating the ability to stay in Boulder, pride of ownership, less financial stress, an ability to take more risks in terms of life changes and so forth. But also clearly, particularly both in comments and the qualitative and quantitative questions, potentially some areas for further evaluation and potential improvement in the program potentially. 49% have had surprises as a homeowner, most in the leading issue there being the unexpected increases in HOA costs. 65% say HOA costs have been higher than expected. 29% say maintenance and repair costs have been higher than expected. So developing realistic expectations for what those costs might be. And in some instances, the comments suggested that the HOA costs were probably artificially low to begin with. And so maybe, that's part of the picture too. And then a variety of other concerns expressed in the comments regarding the appreciation cap and how that limits the ability to make the leap into market rate units. Concerns about the program rules, which are probably in many cases well-intentioned and necessary, but nonetheless frustrating to some folks. With regards to capturing the value of capital improvements, the ability to rent short and long-term, challenges in moving to a different home. For instance, if you have kids and need a larger home, income limits might be restrictive relative to the current market conditions. Also concerns about maintenance and construction, initial construction quality as well. So that's just a very quick wrap up. I know you haven't had a chance to look at this data up until, literally as we speak. I think it's a very rich data set, and, I think there's a lot more that we can look at in terms of deeper dives on segments of people who, for instance, are surprised or dissatisfied or feeling more or less financial security over time. So any questions at this point before we turn to the next survey? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And it just took a second to orient to it, and then
Okay.
I realized how it was flowing with the numbers, so I appreciate that. Any questions? Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. And Dave, you conduct this routinely across, affordable housing across Colorado. Pretty consistent with your expectation? Any nuances for Boulder you could share with us? And any, sometimes certain parts of the data could just jump out at you and go, oh, that's unique. Anything like that you might comment on?
I think maybe as compared to the ski resorts, there's more comments regarding appreciation cap, and I think there's probably more of an expectation in places like Aspen that the free market is so out of reach that, there's probably not a hope of using affordable housing as a stepping stone to free market housing. So I'd say that's one difference. I think the relatively small sample or household sizes, or one person households and two person households, that's fairly common. You see in Aspen, for instance, it may well be an average of 2.1 people per household, and the affordable ownership units in Aspen too. Those are the two that jump to mind immediately. But I think that's a rich area for further exploration. I think satisfaction with the unit is one thing we'll be very interested in comparing. How does, is it comparable here, higher or lower? I think the maintenance issues maybe jumped out a bit more in terms of, generally, I don't think we've seen as many comments regarding construction defects than we have here. And I think HOA fees and the jump rises in HOA fees hasn't been as much of a issue either. But I think we'll look more closely at those types of, or those comparisons.
Is the section on financial security, it struck me, but this is just a guess, that by its very nature, someone who's trying to buy a house that doesn't have enough money to buy the house, so to speak, hence the program, would be by their nature somewhat financially insecure because they're on this edge where a small capital piece or could be an HOA increase is absolutely devastating to them. Is that
very much so? And you can see that, so for instance, as we'll see in the HOA survey, the median cost of an assessment was $1,500. And, that's a big chunk of money for a lot of folks. And you can definitely read a lot of that sort of anxiety regarding financial security. And when you look at financial security relative to the ratio of income to housing costs, the people who feel least secure are paying the highest proportion of their income towards housing. So on the flip side, I think the fact that they now do have a relatively stable housing situation has definitely been a positive in terms of helping increase that sense of financial security.
Adam?
Thank you. First, just a remark. This is amazing, and I would have loved the opportunity to look over it, obviously, and I realized that that was no fault of your own. That was a last-minute thing, but this is mostly for Jeff, actually, that if in the future we sort of realize that we're not going to get the data ahead of time, this is one of those things that I would love to be in the packet beforehand, just because there's so much here, and we could really have a really deep conversation about how much stuff is going on in here. But I'll just say that as a note. So I'm fine postponing things if we have that option, a meeting if we don't have the data available ahead of time to review. I wanted to say the thing that stands out the most to me is it's pretty obvious that for the percentage, 95% have an HOA, that it looks like these people didn't know special assessments were a thing. So whatever we have to do to, mitigate that impact on people, or at least make them aware at the beginning of the process that, yeah, you could be charged or expected to produce thousands of dollars pretty much within a couple months to fix something, that's pretty important. So a detailed list of any projects or scheduled maintenance prior to people actually signing up for, buying a home that has an HOA, I think is super important in this instance, because that's clearly where a lot of the problems are coming from.
I think Jeff can comment on that, but I think I asked Kurt this question as well, and that there's a document they actually sign off on with a discussion around special assessments and HOA fees, correct?
I would have to check and see what that document looks like, the acknowledgement of, I know we have a signed acknowledgement of the restrictions that come with the covenant, whether that includes an acknowledgement by an owner, potential owner, that they understand what the HOA special assessment possibility is. I don't know.
Okay.
I'll check.
All right.
There is a homeownership training that's required before you can purchase the home.
And I went through that, and I know that when I went through it, which was just a couple months ago, there was training in that around the special assessment. And I remember her specifically saying and making a huge point of it, that this is why you want to get on an HOA board the minute you become an owner, is so that you don't get hit with them. So I personally remember that, but yeah, it'd be interesting to see if we could get more information about it.
Just a quick follow-up, but it's pretty clear that an individual, when they are purchasing this, should have some sort of list of potential special assessments or planned maintenance before they essentially sign the contract. It's not necessarily required, I guess. So maybe that's something just as a best practice that we could start doing within the program. Just a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Is that it? Judy?
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. That's okay. Thank you. That was really good. My question is actually for you, Jay. So there were two parts to the final comments, and besides the fact that obviously you're going to send this around to all your staff and congratulate each other for all the good achievements and positive feedback, what are the next steps about the issues that have come to the front of concerns?
Well, that's why we're bringing it to you now, because we would like your thoughts, impressions on what some potential next steps could be. But yeah, no, we haven't identified any. I mean, we have barely had a chance to digest it. And we actually have another presentation ready for you.
Ah.
And this one was done, a survey of management companies. So it provides a slightly different perspective. I don't know, how are we doing on time? Do you?
So typically, we take a 10-minute recess right now, and then before we dive into that piece, if that would be okay, if we could do that. But I think there's a few people that have some more questions before we move on to that next piece, if we could answer those before we take a break and move into the next piece.
Early,
Okay.
up to you.
Somebody new before we go back into Michael? Jack?
I believe it's not a part of what you did here necessarily, but I just want to confirm that you don't have it buried somewhere in that data. Was there any engagement with, I suppose, specifically I'm interested in finding out where these assessments came, if there was any, if you dived into that at all, as far as what the assessments were for, if there were any specific categories and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, there was a question about, how much was the assessment, what was it for, and when did it occur? Relatively few responses for that, so unfortunately, probably, we'll take a closer look, but probably a little hard to make too many generalizations, I guess. Maybe between both this survey and the HOA survey, there were some comments about, well, at least one comment regarding the hail damage, the hailstorm this past summer. I think to some degree fixing those initial construction defects, at least that was mentioned in a few comments. But yeah, those are the only ones that really jump to mind so far.
Michael?
Thank you. I wanted to recall when this matter of HOAs first came before the board, probably 5 or 6 months ago, thereabouts, a comment by board member Nog about the acknowledgement of an HOA when someone's buying, in the context and the emotional context that occurs in, that people are, despite the training, are very excited about buying their, for many, probably a first home, and sort of emotionally blinded to the gravitas of the undertaking of what can happen with HOAs. And it just struck me as an important emotional piece. It's like if anyone's ever checked into a hospital and they say, sign here, you don't really read the disclaimer. You know, you're not really thinking about that. You're thinking, I'd just like to make it through the night. And they're pretty excited. So I thought that was a poignant comment by Board Member Nog earlier, and would be important to remember in that acknowledgement. I don't know how you frame that education process, but it was a dynamic.
Anybody else? Adam?
Just a comment. So we were looking for essentially this for permanently affordable rentals at one point. That's kind of what we were looking for. Is the barrier to that just the sheer amount of surveying that would be required? Since this is a pretty small amount of people, I realize that permanently affordable rentals are much higher.
Question? I can't speak to the, whether it's just a straight line calculation for the cost. I think what we provided to you was that I think it was about 2/3 of the residents of affordable rentals are surveyed by the rental property owners, and they use very different methodologies. They have the primary relationship. If the city, we don't, for example, have names of anybody in our database of who's renting properties, so there'd be some practicalities to overcome. It could certainly be done. We have addresses.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
So, thanks. That was a good reminder, because our intention was to bring like the BHP surveys that they've done in the
Right.
past. They haven't been, I don't think they do it consistently, like year after year, but they have done quite a few, and that would be helpful context as well. So we'll try to get that to you as well.
And I'll piggyback on what Adam's saying as well with the rental ones. It'd be interesting if in our agreements with these property owners that a suggestion or a requirement of annual or biannual satisfaction reports or something along those surveys are done, so that we can see how they're doing as a provider.
Just my last little bit. And those surveys that were provided were primarily from non-for-profit organizations. And my biggest concern is actually with the for-profit organizations. So having something along those lines with that data, I'd love to see the differences between for-profit providers and non-for-profit providers if we have the ability to do so.
You done?
Good.
Terry?
In general, really good report. I think it had a lot of good information. I know we only looked at it for a second, but to me, it's not overly surprising. In general, the people who have permanently affordable housing that they own are pretty happy about it, and they really like it, and that's really good, because that means the program's working, and the consumer, the end result of all the work that goes into creating permanently affordable homes, the people are pretty happy to be owning them. I think you touched on it. My question is, people looking to purchase market rate, what was that again? Was it, because that to me is important.
Yeah.
Using the permanently affordable or the inclusionary zoning housing as a stepping stone into market rate, so then they can start benefiting from the appreciation of the free market, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and there were a number of comments that people felt that they couldn't, because the free market is appreciated so much, while affordable housing is appreciated much less.
Sure.
They felt they wouldn't have the home equity to sort of transfer into a purchase of a free market home. I think that was the gist of it. And, you know, some comments regarding, can the appreciation rate be calculated so it compounds, and or if you live in your unit long enough, can you get a waiver. You know, there were a small number of comments regarding that, but I think a lot of people did express the feeling of being somewhat trapped in their unit just because they couldn't afford a free market home.
Sure.
Maybe some regret.
I don't know if this is on point to your analysis, but do a lot of people move from one affordable home to another? You know what I'm saying? Does that happen? I don't know that. I know that's not really the topic here, but.
I understand, I have asked that question. It's occasional, not very often.
Not very often. So once you
More
buy
frequently,
a.
they move into a market rate.
Okay, and then the last question is, I know on the rental side, you have to qualify your income every time you renew your lease, every year or whatever. That doesn't apply to the ownership side, is that right? So by way of example, or does it?
Correct.
That's correct.
It does not apply.
One-time qualification.
Exactly. So if you were at a certain place in your life where you qualify to purchase an affordable home, and then the next day you win the lottery, you can still stay there forever, right? There's no, is that correct?
That's correct, theoretically. But what we find is that most people, once they do start earning more,
Sure,
they desire nicer finishes, bigger homes.
sure.
Yeah, I think what we find is when people win the lottery, they buy really big houses.
It's just an example to prove a point. Thank you. Good job again. Very nice report.
Does anybody else have any more questions for this section? Yes.
I was just curious because Terry brought up the question about reporting income. It was the income self-reported in your survey?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's 7:30. I would move for a 5-minute recess.
Seconded.
Thank you. Move to. Okay, and we'll start again, Jay, or who's ever, are you leading this one too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
So this was the second survey that was done simultaneously. This was of HOAs, primarily the property management firms that manage the HOAs. This is a little bit short of a presentation, but you can see the outline here. And first, we'll go into the methodology. It was a survey mailed out to HOAs. There was an ability to take the survey either on paper or online. Most of the surveys were mailed to property management firms, which appear to manage probably on the order of 75% of the HOAs. Oh, okay.
And I think we're missing one. Did you get it? Oh, okay, she got it.
I handed one out to everybody.
So there were, one of the first steps was to identify the property management firms and the HOAs in the city. And the state does have a database that sort of tracks that to some degree, although it seems very incomplete. And so we spent a fair amount of time just trying to sort of make sure we had a decent property management company and HOA list. Overall, it appeared that as if there's roughly 300 HOAs in Boulder. There may well be probably more. I'm sure we missed some. But altogether, we got responses from 86 HOAs, a response rate of about 29%. Many property management firms acknowledged receiving the survey, but said they would not participate because they didn't have the time, or it'd take too long, or they felt the information was proprietary, or they needed to get permission from the HOA. I think, however, we had done a similar survey back in 2012, which garnered 43 responses, so at least we got double the response count this time. So I think one thing that we did this time that helped was just making repeated calls to property management firms, just really encouraging them to participate. We also gave all the property management firms and HOAs a $2 bill for every HOA they had, and that probably helped a little bit as well. So in the presentation, we focus primarily here on comparing the 2019 and 2012 results. Given that relatively small sample size of 43 in 2012, that requires some caution interpreting, but overall you do see a lot of strong parallels between the 2 years. So first, property characteristics. This first slide looks at, is the HOA professionally managed? 74% yes, 26% no this year, and you can see that's very similar to the ratio in 2012. Next graph illustrates the number of residential units in the development. Overall, you can see that there was an average of 48 units per responding HOA this year as compared to 80 in 2012, so skewed to so much smaller complexes this year than in 2012. With regards to types of residential buildings in the HOA, altogether, 88% of HOAs had attached units, and that's somewhat higher than 71% in 2012, but in both cases, large majority of HOAs had attached units. You can see at the bottom that 17% had detached units this year. In 2012, that was significantly higher, 37%, and I think the survey reached a lot of, golf course type or, single-family communities that don't fit the mold of the affordable housing HOA. So one of the analyses, kind of deeper dives that we're going to be doing as a follow-up to this is kind of just focusing on those HOAs that have attached units insofar as that's kind of the primary comparison and standard that the affordable inventory is working with. With regards to HOA services, and maybe I should just step back before jumping into that, I'll say one other piece of information we collected on the survey is, are there any affordable units in the HOA? And about a quarter of responding HOAs have affordable units, and that was very similar to the last time. And we're going to also look at segmentation of HOAs with and without affordable units. Overall, a lot of parallels between the two. So moving along to services provided by the HOA. So common amenities, overall, relatively similar mix of common amenities both years with, common landscaping at present in the HOAs, 80% of HOAs having that this year, similar 84% last year. Most HOAs also having common off-street parking. Generally similar types of different amenities. Obviously, the HOAs have to pay for these, and all this fits into the dues and assessments. One thing I'll mention too is that we did get budgets for about 55 or about half of responding HOAs, which should break out the cost of at least some of these items to the extent that their budget's itemized that way. We haven't looked at those budgets in detail yet. With regards to services provided by the HOA, again, a lot of commonalities this year and 7 years ago. Almost all HOAs provide snow removal, insurance, about 8 and 10 provide exterior maintenance and trash removal and recycling. About 70% provide HOA management and water and sewer costs. About half provide pest control, and smaller shares provide those other services towards the bottom. Moving on to HOA finances. First, we've got what is the method for calculating HOA dues? And you can see that for about half the HOAs this year, dues are the same for all the units in the complex. And for most of the other HOAs, the dues vary by floor area, 43% this year. So that's, again, relatively similar results this year and 7 years ago. With regards to the average monthly dues per unit, you can see, looking at the bottom at the average there, the average is $308 this year as compared to $177 in 2012, so a pretty substantial increase. That $308 for those 86 HOAs, it compares to the 241 that we saw for the affordable homeowner survey. So dues are relatively higher when you look at the broader market than for affordable owners. And it could well be that those affordable owners, to the extent that some of them are in units, their dues vary by floor area. They might not pay as much on average. If you isolate just those HOAs that have affordable units, and that turns out to be 20 HOAs in this sample, the monthly HOA cost is identical to the overall, or virtually identical. The median, actually it is identical. The median HOA cost is $300 for the overall sample of 86, or for this question is probably 80 or so responding HOAs, maybe close to 86. There's also a median of $300 for those complexes that have affordable units. I guess another comparison would be for those complexes that have affordable units, collectively they have about 35% of the affordable unit stock. That $300 overall would compare to the $241 median monthly HOA cost for affordable owners. So again, while the owners complain or have concerns about those costs and the rising costs, it's still somewhat less than the general market, even within complexes that have affordable units. One asterisk being that, this isn't the entire market in this survey. This is just essentially responding properties only. Moving along to funding of capital reserves and major improvements. Does the HOA have a capital reserve account separate from the operating account? And you can see that 90% do, and that's common, a generally accepted best practice, so encouraging to see that. With regards to the capital account balance per unit, You can see at the average at the bottom that the capital account balance per unit is, 2.5 times higher now than it was back in 2012. And if you look at the percentage distributions, some of those complexes had relatively small capital reserves per unit, 46% with less than $1,000 per unit. Even if you look at HOAs which have attached units only, you see better funding this year than in 2012 in terms of these capital reserves. So probably some of the increases that owners were talking about in terms of dues going up, the one benefit has likely been that that's resulted in healthier capital reserve balances. Is the capital reserve account funded by, how is it funded? So you can see 95% funded via a portion of monthly dues. A much smaller share use ad hoc special assessments. So with regards to predictability, it's encouraging to see that most are relying on dues. Moving along to special assessments, this year you can see that 34% of HOAs have had special assessments in the past 6 years, and that's up from 10% in the 2012 survey. The median cost of a lump sum special assessment was $1,500. The range was pretty wide from, I think, so a follow-up question asked people to identify the year, amount, and purpose of the special assessments. At the high, I think the range was on the order of $250,000 to $18,000. So pretty significant variation there. And as we were kind of talking offline, it could be potentially interesting to see how many of those, how much the building permit records might possibly show or provide a more complete record of what special assessments have been for and what those costs may have been, to the extent they're identifiable in building permit records. Has the HOA completed a capital reserve study in the past 6 years? A much lower share this year at 46% versus 78%, so potentially some concern there. My understanding is that it's typically good practice to do that, and maybe every 5 years-ish, perhaps. With regards to, moving on to the next question, how would you describe the HOA's general financial condition? You can see 36% excellent, 36% good, 21% fair, and 6% poor. And these responses are very much tied to what that capital reserve balance per unit looks like. So I'm just going to look at some detailed results here. With regards to, okay, so those properties that rated the HOA as being in excellent financial condition had an average reserve balance of $7,000 per unit. Those who said the general financial condition was poor had an average of $1,000, $1,036 capital reserve per unit, and then the good and fair kind of scale in between those. So that capital reserve balance is really, and how well our capital reserves funded relative to the reserve study, that's really the key benchmark that HOAs appear to use to evaluate the general financial condition, or that at least shows a very strong relationship. With regards to, has the HOA taken any of the following actions in the past 12 months to address any budgetary shortfalls or constraints? If you look at the bottom and the share that say none, 19 and 40%, if you reverse that, it essentially indicates that 81% of HOAs have taken steps in 2019, and that's up from 60% in 2012. If you look at the top, you can see that 72% have increased dues this year, or increased dues in the past 12 months, as compared to 40% back in 2012. HOA has been more likely to also levy special assessments, the second category at 19 versus 5%. And conversely, they've been somewhat less likely to take various cost-cutting measures such as reducing landscaping expenditures, where it's 10% this year versus 18% previously, deferred maintenance, 9% this year versus 15% previously, and allowing residents to perform minor tasks, 4% versus 13%. And perhaps, I mean, this is getting to a little speculation, but certainly probably the economic circumstances back in 2012, when there's still the overhang from the recession and a lot of foreclosures, a lot of delinquencies with HOA fees, and probably a reluctance to raise HOA fees. That probably fed into some of these differences then versus now, when the economy is much stronger, greater employment levels, at least for the free market stock, dramatic appreciation in units. So probably some of those economic dynamics figuring into this to some degree. Moving on to the next slide, and these are just a couple of wrap-up interesting informational results. Would you be able to provide a copy of the most current annual budget? So encouraging that about 55% were willing to do so this year, similar share previously. And then finally, would you like to receive a summary copy of the aggregate results? 82% yes. So great that this information might hopefully be helpful to HOAs more broadly. And then finally, just to wrap up, I think, at the top, some differences in the HOA profiles between this year and 7 years ago, so we have to be a little cautious in comparing the 2 years. In particular, fewer units in the responses this year and less likely to have detached homes this year. And we can control for that by just looking at segments of the data and, for instance, by looking at just attached units. A lot of similarities in the common amenities and services provided by HOAs both years. A lot of similarities in the finances of HOAs with a similar mix of methods of counting dues, either identical for all the units or varying by floor size. 90% roughly using capital reserve accounts, and 95% funding capital reserves from monthly dues. And then also some notable differences with monthly dues being about $100 higher now than 2012, 300 versus 201 median dues costs. Higher instance of lump sum and special assessments in the prior 6 years, at 34% this year versus 10% in 2012. On the flip side, with those higher costs, also stronger capital reserve balances at a median of $2,700 per unit now versus $1,200 per unit in 2012. Capital reserve study less likely to have been updated recently in the past 6 years. And then HOAs being more proactive in taking steps to address budgetary shortfalls or feeling the need to address budgetary shortfalls at 81% versus 60%, particularly by increasing dues and levying special assessments, and being less likely to cut costs by deferring maintenance or allowing residents to perform minor tasks or looking at cutting other operating costs. So again, just a very quick overview of some of the key findings, and I think, again, an ability to sort of drill down more deeply in the results, and we'll be working with staff on looking at, some additional breakdowns.
So I'm pretty sure probably everybody has at least one or two questions. I'm curious, did all the respondents answer all the questions? And if not, how did you factor that into the percentages?
So, yes, but not everybody answered every single question, but I would say probably on the order of, for any given question, it was probably typically 90% plus answered the questions. For instance, I guess the question regarding have there been any lump sum special assessments in the past 6 years? And if so, what year and what was the amount and the cost? That was one where 76 of the 86 respondents answered, so probably 85%. In that case, we just took only the respondents, and we assumed that, the non-respondents may well have, I guess you're never certain, but in the results, it effectively assumes that they had the same sort of distribution of patterns. And similarly with the other survey, not everybody answered every question, so we just focused on just the respondents only, didn't try and impute any results for non-respondents.
So we could just go around the room if you'd like. Juliet, you want to start?
Thank you very much for that great info. I had a couple questions. I know inflation has been relatively low in the last 7 years, but I was curious about if there was any adjustment made between the dollars in 2012 and the dollars in current day dollars.
That's a great question. There was not, so it's just nominal dollars. I mean, it would be interesting to look at inflation. I'm guessing it's been 20 to 30% in Denver Metro since then, and probably higher for housing, at least for, but it would be interesting to look at that, yeah.
That's one of the sort of the next steps that we've been thinking about, and even, comparing it to other housing costs, like how much rents have gone up in the same period of time. Is it comparable? Is it not? It'd be interesting.
Yes,
as well.
definitely. That'd be very interesting. I was curious if you collected any information about the age of the housing developments, how old they were, the ones in 2012 versus 2019.
We did in 2012, and this year we could look it up because we asked, we know the name of the HOA. If we didn't ask it on the survey, we can go to assessor records and we could look it up.
Just to see if that
Sure.
might impact capital reserves and things like that. Just
Good point.
a question.
Great
And
point.
then another question was, I don't know if there was any free response to any of these questions, but was there any comment about the increased cost of building materials and construction as relates to labor? And that being a concern of why maybe HOA dues had increased or capital reserve. Yeah, and that's, I promise you, that's my last question.
Okay. We did, so there was, the main sort of question that sort of was designed to encourage that feedback was asking if people had any comments on the financial status of the HOA, the excellent, good, fair, or poor. And relatively few HOAs responded. It's probably 12 out of the 86, 12, 13 or so. And most of them commented on the degree to which their reserves were adequately funded. And, was it 50% funded, 70, 80%? No comments that I recall about the cost of building materials or costs of labor. We didn't specifically ask about HOA costs and, any factors that may have been driving those costs. So, yeah.
I would just, I think it's safe to assume that increasing construction costs are contributing. I mean, just like they are to constructing new affordable housing or any construction. So I think that's just a really good observation.
Thank you for this report. I don't have any questions about this. I would just like, when everybody's done with their questions, to discuss a little bit next steps about how we can best give you feedback. That's all.
Thanks, Dave. Great, very insightful report. Two questions. One, do you have some color on the monthly capital contributions, the range or average or median, like that? And the other question is some HOAs I've seen in the past do this. Some of these are relatively small HOAs. An alignment of the capital needs assessment and the monthly contribution and deferred maintenance to kind of say where that is.
Great questions. And, I think we don't have, we do have the budgets, which we can look at. And I think that will be a interesting thing to look at is what is that monthly contribution from the operating into reserves.
Right.
We haven't looked at that. And we don't have the reserve studies, in terms of what those numbers are looking like. We can look at the budgets and see maybe some of them might possibly, if they've budgeted the capital reserve expenditures as well as the revenues, we can look at that and, yeah.
Just as an eyeball, in like the multifamily lending space, for example, we typically are 250 to 300 a unit as far as reserves. And so if I take that like by the $4,500 was an average in the one to kind of back in, it's about an 18-month period, which didn't seem like a long time. But then I'd make the observation that oftentimes capital assessments are kind of lumpy. They're not, you do an average, but then they're kind of, they're sort of discontinuous, if you will, of, a roof happens once every, 10 or 15 or 20 years, depending, or other things like that. So the smoothing part is interesting, but then you can have one big call, which causes all the consternation of people that don't have the money, or there maybe is no debt capacity of the HOA to borrow money.
Great point, yeah. I think the survey didn't go into as much depth and just all those financial metrics as could potentially be useful, but clearly a relationship between at least a general impression of how the HOA's financial status is looking and sort of that capital reserve balance.
In fairness, some of those may be unfair because it's just the data you have available doesn't permit that depth.
Yeah. So, yeah, good. Yeah, thanks for that.
Besides the questions that have already been asked here, I got a couple others. One is, so if I got this right, it appears that HOAs that are serving affordable housing versus HOAs that are just serving only market rate, affordable housing HOAs are performing as well or potentially better as far as their costs overall,
Right.
from what we just see,
Yes.
just looking at
Correct.
cost basis. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
And I don't know if there's any way to pull this out of the data or if there was any data collected in this one or between the two. I'm curious if there's a correlation between the unit size and the HOA cost as it relates to square foot, based on a square foot basis.
We can certainly look at that from the standpoint of the homeowner survey, where we at least would have number of bedrooms, and how does that correlate with the HOA cost? We do, I guess, with regards to costs by unit type from the homeowner survey. Let's see here. Just going to quickly look up how the HOA cost varies by unit type insofar as, okay. So yes, there's a distinct difference. Okay, let's look here. All right. Okay, so single-family homes, affordable single-family homes have an average HOA of 103, pretty cheap, which compares to 254 for townhomes, duplexes, and 271 for condos. So single-family homes definitely, obviously wouldn't have as many common elements, particularly with regarding the structure, but it looks reasonably similar for condos versus townhouses and duplexes. And then we were just to narrow down to the subsegment and look at number of bedrooms.
Yeah.
We'll follow up with that.
So one breakdown of the data I think would be insightful is if you broke it down based on whether or not the HOA is professionally managed, just to see what are we paying for with professional management, and does that actually lead to a, maybe lower HOA fees or at least a better reserve? The thing that stands out to me is the the decrease in reserve study. Was that what it was called?
Right.
Yeah. So if, as I see here, HOAs are being professionally managed at the same rate, if not slightly higher than they were, yet it doesn't seem like they have as good a, impact or idea of what's going on in their reserves. That kind of is concerning to me. What are people paying for, if not preparation for bad things to happen? So that's just the point that really stuck out to me. Also, just to keep all this data in mind, it would strike me that it's probably the best of the HOAs that are responding to this, maybe not the worst of the HOAs. So that's pretty common practice. If you don't think you're doing a very good job and you have a lot of complaints, you're not going to respond to a survey. So this might be a rosy set of data we're looking at.
Point well taken, yeah.
Well, Dave, aren't they also, the majority of them are through management companies, right? So
Correct.
they wouldn't necessarily decide which ones to report on.
Correct. That is correct. No, yeah, it was less of a HOA decision than a property management company decision as to who responded. But could well be that those property management companies who had problematic HOAs were,
They get rid of them.
In
Let
other
someone
words,
else
who
manage
sent the
them.
$2 back?
right. Yeah. So,
Jeff, Our affordable housing program started, what, about 25 years ago, maybe? 20, 25 years ago? Maybe a little longer, but really took force with a 20% on-site and all that kind of stuff. Is that about right?
If you're referring to the overall affordable housing efforts, those go back more like 45, 50 years, but the ownership component
There you go.
started in 93, I believe. There were some efforts before then, but the permanently affordable
Yeah.
was 93 with the first home program, I believe. So
The reason I say that is because that's when it started. So the majority, the oldest affordable housing unit in some of these HOAs is 30, 25 years old, and that's the oldest. So the rest are newer, right, for the most part. A large portion of them are newer.
For the most part, there have been some acquisitions of existing units which would be captured in some of the HOAs, but if they were new construction, mostly starting 25 years ago.
Exactly. The reason I bring that up is because the big issue here is special assessments. Those are what really shock people, right? And special assessments come up when big things need to be fixed, and usually big things need to be fixed when they get really old, like roofs and siding and concrete and those types of things. So what I'm seeing is there might be a lot more special assessments coming up here in the next decade, because a lot of these homes are or these HOA buildings are gonna start getting to the point where they need these things, and then you're gonna need more money to fix them, and construction costs are at a crazy all-time high. We won't go into that right now, but so I think there's a real problem here, because as we talked about offline, David, you take a building that has 4 units in it, and 3 of them are market rate, and 1 of them's an affordable unit, and you spread out the HOA fees proportionally per square foot. Well, okay, the affordable unit is a $200,000 unit, and the market rate unit is an $800,000 unit. So if it's $300 a month across the board, to the person who has the $800,000 unit, that's not that big a deal probably, but to the person who has the $250,000 unit, it is probably a really big deal. So I don't know how to fix it, but I know that it's there, and it's probably going to get worse as time goes on, because the bigger special assessments, I think, are most likely coming down the pike.
Any other questions? And Judy had brought up how we would move forward with any additional questions if we started processing this, and I would assume email contact to you unless there's something else anybody from the board would like to do. Corey's like, not me.
And you're on Housing Advisory Board email, right?
Yes. Actually, I get all your emails.
Oh, nice.
You can send them to the group, and that'll take care of it.
All right, is there any, yes, Jacques?
A quick one. I think maybe Judy mentioned this, but did you want to follow up with us on what or how we can best give you, what input specifically you might be looking for out of this, not just how we get it to you, but what in particular?
Like I said before, sort of your thoughts, impressions, ideas for solutions. And I don't think this is sort of an easy problem to solve. So that's why we have you guys, right? To help offer your expertise and ideas.
Advisory.
Yep. So, it's entirely up to you. I mean, you could dedicate a future meeting to talk about it more. You could do it by email. It's entirely up to the group. But we'd be happy to answer questions by email or come back. Probably won't have David, but I'd be happy to come back.
Thank you so much, David. That was awesome.
Last thing.
Yeah.
If we did have data requests, are you able to get that information back to us?
Typically, that's pretty easy to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So,
anything else?
Nope.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you very much.
Okay, we'll move on to matters from the board. And that's pretty much going to be engagement for a little while. So We've got some reports, and do you want to just take over, Adam?
Sure. So the first item, I think, Corey, are you going to pull all these up for us on the computer potentially?
Somebody would have to sit here.
Jeff, you okay with that? Yep. Thank you. So the very first one on the list here is HAB Engagement Committee Purpose and Goals of the Engagement Committee Purpose and Goals. So, so this is just putting out there the final version. We just wanted to put that in there to make sure that that's on the record as what the goals are for this year. And yeah, that was the last iteration, so there's no decision to be made there. I'll wait until our next thing is up on the screen to talk about it.
Adam, do you want to, does anybody have any comments about it before we go on to the next one?
Sure. The only two who potentially haven't seen this are our new members, so.
Did you see it? It's being pulled up on the screen right now, but.
I believe it's in the packet as well, right?
Yes. Judy.
I just wanted to mention.
Judy, your mic's not on, and if you could pull it towards your
Where were
face.
you? I got it now, thanks. I just wanted to mention for Terry and Juliet that these have already been voted on and approved. The reason why we're putting it with the packet is we wanted to, at a minimum, create an official record of this. And both this and the next one, I believe that Zach thinks he can create a link to our website so that all board-approved reports can be looked up by the public.
So just based on what you're saying as well, especially since we have new members, when we talk about board approved, and are we saying, and this is kind of more of a process question, that once something's been approved, it's never open for discussion again? Or if they wanted to add a comment in this section, is it not okay?
Well, that's at the discretion of the entire board by vote, but this is just for 2019. This isn't forever written in stone anyway.
Okay.
And yes, I think anything can specifically be called up if they want to make an amendment to it at any time.
Okay, great. Jeff?
If
It's hard to see you over there, Jeff.
Yeah. If the intent is to create a record, it would probably be worth including in the header or something, adopted by Housing Advisory Board on such and such a date.
Thank you. Any comments? Okay.
Great, moving on to the next item. We were asked, as part of the Affordable Housing Resident Concerns Committee, to provide a report. And we're gonna make a motion to adopt that report. So that report was in the packet as well, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm gonna go ahead and make a motion. I move to adopt the 2018 HAB Affordable Housing Resident Concerns Committee report.
I second.
Okay, and we'll open it up for discussion. Any comments? Judy?
I just want to make one comment again for Terry and Juliet. This was a temporary committee, and this is the last thing that committee will do after this report is adopted and put into the website. If Zach can do that for us, then that committee disbands.
So the only comment that I have is towards the very end on the last 3 paragraphs, and I brought this up when you had sent it out in the packet requesting any comments on it. was in essentially this third small paragraph where it says, have decided to forego a public hearing on affordable housing, and then it skips to the next sentence of, however, have instead decided to provide an educational session on the affordable housing experience. And then in the next paragraph, it says, housing staff and general public will be invited to attend and participate in a more interactive manner. So to me, if we're having an educational session, educational to me means that you're calling in people to educate them. And then in the next paragraph, you're saying an interactive manner. So it seems like you're having both. And I pointed out just, it seemed incongruent.
That was an oversight on my part. That should read, instead of educational, it should read learning. So we can change that.
Learning or listen?
Or, sorry, listening session.
Okay.
Yep, listen.
Any other comments or? Okay, so we'll move to a vote. All in favor? Boy, there's more to count now. So we have 5 of us saying yes, 6 of us saying yes, 7 unanimous. It was a slow roll.
All right, next series of items are essentially different mediums that we're going to be approaching for the educational section next month. And they all have a similar sort of amount of information as to what's going to happen, but we wanted to make sure everyone looked at them before we sent them out. So we'll just go down the list real quick.
So Adam, I think a little bit more framework for this, because it took me a minute while I was reading all this to understand. So maybe just a little bit more framework or context as you're explaining what everybody's reviewing here.
Gotcha. I see here that the educational sessions poll outline is in front. And sorry, I just skipped ahead of what I thought. I thought that one was going to be at the end of all this. So if we want to talk about this right now, that's fine.
Does it make sense to skip it for context? Like put it to the end?
This makes sense. This is fine. I'll go with this.
Is this fine? Okay.
Yep. So over the year, while we had been trying to get more public feedback and get people in to talk to us, the biggest thing that stood out was the affordable housing resident concerns, because we had multiple people at multiple occasions come and talk to us about it, because it was a major issue with them, especially the rising rents and amenities costs increases. So we decided through over time and a few interesting conversations on the board that maybe the best way to engage with the community is to try something a little bit different, and that is these listening sessions. It says educational here, that should say listening, and it will in the future going forward, so feel free to cross that out. And sort of the goal of this is to interact with segments of the community that are usually underheard or underserved in some way. So just for an example, people we don't often hear from, we're permanently affordable housing residents, so we thought that was a great place to start. And this topic is about finding 2 more of those that we could hopefully invite and listen to this year, and maybe make this a continuous program. So that's the goal of this outline, is to adopt 2 more topics for 2019. And just a couple examples of things or other groups that we might be interested in hearing from. People with disabilities, seniors, people of color, students, all sort of minority groups in the community who generally we don't get to hear from very often. So that's sort of the goals of these sessions.
Okay, and so before we move on, I just want to, do you guys clearly understand what we're talking about with these listening sessions? Any questions about that? Are you shaking your head, no, you don't understand? Okay, so this goes back to just that process we were just talking about earlier, is the goal is to soften and do outreach in a different manner. So using this format that we have set up right now and do specific targeted outreach to particular groups that may feel marginalized or not, or disenfranchised in some manner by the city. So we would specifically ask them to come in and we would have a listening session around, say if it was seniors, what are the issues you're really facing? How can we take your cause towards the city council? And that would be a topic. So what engagement put together was this list of a process of how we could decide on who we want to reach out to, and then ask them through advertising and trying to pull them into a session. Does that make sense?
And you're talking about asking them very specifically with respect to housing issues?
Yes. Yep. And the reason why it's important that you guys are clear is because we're adopting this process. And so it's important that you feel included in that decision-making process. So feel free at this point, while we've got it on the table, to ask any questions.
So I guess,
Michael?
Are there, like I noticed in the last survey, like if they're like special interest groups, and I appreciate your summary of that, because I didn't understand that. It wasn't clear to me.
Yeah.
And I noticed like in the last survey, there were no respondents that were Native American or Eskimos.
Right.
And so we'd be excluding them?
Well, and what's interesting that we don't often talk about is that actually Boulder County's most recent numbers put people of color in a total at 22%. So a lot more than what we're talking about. So to me, that could be a topic of opening it up to what are we not hearing? What are we not asking? So, and I use the example of seniors.
That's a big number.
Yeah, like the example of seniors is like, before Arthur came and spoke to us, I wasn't really thinking about accessibility on all of the units. And so it was informative, incredibly informative to have him come and talk about it. So these sessions would be more open to kind of topic specific and allowing us to engage and outreach specifically. So like if it was mobile home parks, we'd want as many people as possible from mobile home parks and to come in and talk to us about the issues and situations that they have coming up. Judy?
So I just wanted to add, so this is just the process by how we pick the additional 2 topics without having to spend a whole lot of time discussing it at the meeting. You know, so we can just send our ideas. Corey will send it out to everyone. We'll vote at the meeting, and the top 2 will be the 2.
So part of what makes our process a little bit longer and harder in all of these is that we're trying to agree to process and also do what we need to do to move a situation forward. So when you get these, what we did too early on for HAB was that we would start these meetings and we'd have so much of this to deep dive into. The reason it goes into the packet and we spend time with it before we get to these meetings is that we can ask each other or be prepared for questions or anything like that. So you can, when you get these packets, feel free to, if you have any questions, put it back out to the group. None of us can respond to you, but we're then prepared as you get here to answer any questions that it may have come up for you. Does that make sense?
So let me just make sure I understand the purpose of this. I did read all this, and I appreciate it getting sent out a week in advance, so there was some time to process. But it's already been decided by this board that these listening sessions, we've adopted the name listening, right? 2 to 3 of them are going to take place within calendar year 2019, right? Okay, so we know that. And that one of those topics has been decided upon already, which is the affordable housing experience that has been adopted. So the question really is, how is this board going to go about adopting additional topics that they want to include in 2019 as part of these listening experiences? And so this is the structure by which we would, the method that the group would use, your proposed method of selection. Is Is that right? Okay, so I understand. Process, okay. I just want to make sure. Thank you.
That's exactly it. So what we're choosing to, the motion is right now, is this the process we want to adopt on this first one? And again, it's not set in stone because we may try this out and try something out and it doesn't work. And that's the beauty of us being a brand new board, is we get to try things out and then talk about whether or not it worked and back up a little bit and try again. Adam, you had more?
I just need to make the motion.
Yes. And just so that you know, is like he'll make the motion, somebody seconds it, and then we'd open it for discussion, and then you can ask questions about it. Exactly. So whenever we do, so whenever anybody brings something forth, they bring it forth as a motion first, and then somebody will second it, and then it's open for discussion, and we can make any friendly amendments and then it'll go to a vote. So go ahead, Anna.
Great. I make the motion to adopt the listening sessions poll outline.
I second.
Okay, now it's open for discussion, so if you want to amend anything, or if you want to ask a question or bring up any spelling stuff.
Okay. So I don't know if, Terry, you feel this way, because we're both new, or anyone else has a question, but one of the things that would be helpful to me is to understand the rationale behind each of these points and why. For example, narrow the housing topics, number one, that are not on current council work plan. Just to, I see you have a sentence, sort of an explanatory sentence, but what is the rationale behind that? And you know, obviously some of these are self-explanatory, but it would be helpful to go through and understand the reasoning behind each of these.
So do either one of you just want to go briefly, why did you make the decision on each one of these?
So the first one is anything that's on the council work plan about housing comes to us anyway. So we will have a public hearing on anything that we have to give a recommendation for. So we'd be repeating something we'll be doing anyway in a public hearing. So that's why we don't need to do any council things. Did that answer that part?
Is a public hearing just that 10-minute session at the beginning?
No, that's the open comment section. So the open comment session, anyone can come to talk about anything about housing that they want. The public hearing it's posted ahead of time as a public hearing, and it's usually a little later in the meeting, and people come and talk about it, and that's when we will give our input to staff to pass on to city council.
And it's usually about a specific
Yeah.
issue, something bigger like alpine balsam or something along those lines.
And then narrow the 2019 topics to those that are not particularly controversial. I'll just say I think we tried to raise an issue that we wanted to investigate that was fairly controversial, and council flat out was not interested in that. So we're trying to look at things that aren't especially controversial. That was our sense, and that was something I think the board had discussed. Somebody jump in if that's not correct. But those are the only ones probably that need explanation, maybe. Let me know.
I had one. As it relates to selecting topics that are not particularly controversial, is there anything in here that would mandate maybe running the topic by people who have been in this part of our housing area for a very long time, and maybe have the institutional knowledge of an issue that was brought up and what the outcome was of that issue, and perhaps why it should or should not be brought up again? Is that part of the process?
The shoulds. Jeff, do you want to answer that? Do you have a mic up there?
I mean, if asked, I can certainly share my opinion. There's always going to be a gray area. Some things, if they have come up in the community discussions before and there's been a lot of conflict over it, then we could identify that as probably controversial. If it hasn't been brought up before, or if it is a topic that on the surface does not appear to have any significant trade-offs, hearing from seniors, for example, about their housing challenges is informative, and it can eventually turn into actions that may be controversial. But just hearing that is not necessarily controversial, I would say. That's how I would reply.
Whereas
if asked on something like that.
Whereas if we bring up occupancy limits as a listening, that's controversial because the city doesn't want to have that conversation around policy on that.
So then I would move to make a friendly amendment to elaborate on that point a little bit, that the team, the staff will be solicited for their institutional knowledge around a particular subject so that we are well informed about what the history is on that particular subject in making a selection.
So the fun part about friendly amendments is you get to,
I get to write it?
yeah, you get to say what it is that you're thinking.
I'm just confused about something. Do you mean that anyone who wants to submit a topic needs to talk to a staff person to find out the history? Or do you mean they can if they want to? Or I'm just not understanding what you mean.
I think it's important to understand, yeah, so if you're going to submit a topic, I think whatever the process is for soliciting staff to get the institutional, to tap into their institutional knowledge before the, I guess before the board adopts it, the board should have the awareness of institutional knowledge that exists about a particular topic before everyone agrees to it.
So then, are you making the friendly amendment that anyone who submits a topic will have checked it out with staff to get the institutional, to get the background?
So let's use an example, because that'll probably be a little bit easier. If you're interested in meeting and have a topic of senior citizens and you want to have a listening session, your amendment would say that if I'm moving towards that, I would request like a check-in with staff that this is along the lines of something that they could provide information on the topic or a background on the topic, and that it's within council's purview and our purview to work on? Is that what you're hearing?
Something like that. Like, just if senior citizens is a great one. If that was something that I wanted to explore, I think it would be incumbent on me to ask staff what knowledge they had about this subject and as it relates to housing, as it's been brought up before in the city and in any kind of meeting, so that we were informed about any issues that might come up, and it may influence whether or not the board wanted to adopt that particular subject.
So I know that this can go, and I'm so glad you raised your finger, because I was just going to say, I love Jeff because he's the all-wise one, and he will bring this together in a really nice, tight way for us. I've
Drafted a potential amendment to try and capture that in yellow there.
I have the 2019. Perfect. Mm-hmm. So then that friendly amendment goes to Adam, and he can choose to accept it or not.
Accepted.
Okay. Is there any other discussion points or topics?
I just have another question. So that doesn't slow down this process in any way. It just means that any of us who want a topic will check in with Jeff as staff and find out if it's valuable or not, and then they can put it on the list to Corey, correct?
Does that feel complete to you?
I would hope it would expedite the process because we'd have more information sooner and could decide whether, not waste a lot of time debating something that was not worth debating. Thank you.
Michael?
On number one, I'm still stuck on number one. That when you say narrow the housing topics, could you be more specific on narrow the house? These are the ones, what are they that are not on the council work plan? And then in the last part of the sentence where it says on all those topics, is there some way we could be more specific on what that is?
Judy?
Well, the council has a work plan, the printed 2018, 2019 work plan. And so we were talking about not having a topic on anything for that because it's going to be coming to us like Alpine balsam's going to be coming to us. I think large lots going to be coming to us. Those are all important topics that we all really care about, but we don't need to have a separate meeting on that because we will be having a public hearing on any of those. So that's all we meant, is to not duplicate things, not have a listening session about things we're going to be doing anyway.
I find when I read that, words like those are not very specific. So I struggle when I read that for what the meaning is and whether it could be clearer.
So Jeff, could we maybe redraft that sentence that just says nothing on council's work plan, something along those lines? Any topic outside of council's work plan?
So is this entire process to address topics not on council's work plan? Is that the point? And why can't we just say that the point of this is to address topics outside of council's work plan? Wouldn't that be, I mean, wouldn't that just be, can we say it easier? Because it just seems awkward to me. So when I read it, I don't know what you want to do. And I want to help you, I just don't know what you want to do.
So as a point of process in this, when we get these in the packet, so that we don't spend 45 minutes on just wordsmithing, the reason we do this in advance is so that everybody can read through these and make these suggestions before we get here.
Let me explain why that doesn't work.
Yep.
For exactly the reason that we're having this discussion now, I don't know how to do that in what constructively would be like a sequential, a serial meeting to accomplish that. Because in the readability, until I had the context of this discussion, I don't know how I would have made that comment at all, absent that discussion, because I read this, I read the materials, I didn't understand it.
Did you watch last meeting?
Did I watch the entire last meeting?
Or listen to our meeting?
No.
Okay, because that would have given you context, and I'm not saying.
But I'm not going to sit through 3 hours to figure out what a one-page memo, the document should speak for itself. I should be able to pick up this within the 4 corners of the page, and I would expect that to be able to read that. So I'm being asked to read a document, I read it, and I can't come to any conclusion meaningful to what that really means, even to comment on it. So I appreciate your comment about getting the materials early, but they need to be with sufficient background and context. It didn't say, this won't make sense unless you watch the last meeting.
Okay, would in those situations, where you didn't, in those, and you missed the last meeting and didn't have the context in it, and granted, I'm hearing you about picking up the document, would it have helped to just send them a message back? It's not serial to respond back to this and have, because we had set it up so that you could send something to Corey and just say,
sure,
I don't understand this letter, so that we're prepared then for that I need more context, or this doesn't explain to me something. Go ahead, Jeff.
So any individual board member can talk to any other individual board member without triggering the public meeting requirements, particularly for something that is, I would say in this kind of situation, talk to the drafter. You can do that directly. I think even though it may not, it would get a little touchy if you were starting to try and develop content and say, I talk to Adam and then say, why don't you check with Judy? That then triggers a serial meeting. But for context explanation, I don't think you would run afoul of it if you just asked one person. Mm-hmm. But we can check with Aaron if that's a concern.
And again, the point is so that we don't have this tension when we get here and everybody's like, I don't get it, and we've got 2 people that worked hard on it, and they're prepared, because we've asked them 3 meetings now in a row to come back with clearer and clearer documents. And I know they want to move forward, and we have a meeting coming up in May. So how we work together in trying to disband some of the tension, and so that we're as productive as possible in these meetings that are both process and content related. So Whatever you need, I'm willing to help try and facilitate that. We just need to try and put something in place, and we build on that every meeting, which is first we asked for motions, then we asked for these documents beforehand. And so again, whatever we can do to get to a point where we're making decisions in the meetings and not just trying to wordsmith or redraft would be helpful. Judy?
So point of information, there's, the friendly amendment is on the table. So I would just like to suggest you may want to consider that since it's now already up there, and since what you said, the changes to the wording is now up there, that you modify your friendly amendment to say, to adopt the changes that are up there, because that meets your.
Does it meet what Michael wants, though? So
I thought it did. We changed the wording, yes?
I'm asking Michael.
Look, I don't want to try and be the arbiter. I'm just, my sense, I don't know, clearly they worked very hard on this, and I understand that. What strikes me is, would you consider giving it to someone and reading the document cold and saying, what's your takeaway from this of what we're doing? I find it's not uncommon when a group will work together of 2 or 3 people to come up with something that's really great, but didn't show it to someone to say, when you read this, what do you come away with? Mm-hmm. Because I had a tough time reading it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to, I mean, I could pick up the phone and do it, but at some point it's like, you wanted to write it. I'd like to imagine I could pick it up and read it and understand what you want to do so I can contribute. And I don't know how to do that with this.
Jacques?
Well, I guess I just wanted to ask Michael here, we have made an adjustment to it now. Number 1 now says select housing topics that are not on the current council work plan. Does that
let me ask,
answer the question?
If this works for all of you, then I don't want to stand in the way of that moving forward.
Well, I can speak personally that and Adam can attest to it, I redrafted all of these because they were so convoluted for me personally. I picked them up and couldn't understand them. And then, and Adam can also attest that I got pissed because I was like, I sent all these redrafts and then they got redrafted and redrafted again and still were convoluted to me. So the struggle I have is that when people do put these out and there's only one of us responding and they don't get feedback and then we get to this spot that it's a juggernaut. Does that make sense? So how do we move forward as a board in a constructive way where people feel like the work that they're doing is honored? And I get you because brevity is my thing. I'm like, let's do 1 paragraph, call it a day. Right. And so how do we get to a point where we can have good process and move forward with a May 24th meeting that we have coming up? Jeff, do you have any insight you want to add?
At this point, I think there is a bigger discussion to have about meeting preparation, material preparation, what formats will work better, that's been identified. If you want to, I would recommend maybe, is this close enough to capture enough of the ideas to move forward? One way of doing that is to, I think as Michael just did, to say, if this works for everyone else, I can move forward with it. Another would be just put it to a vote, see if it's close enough for the majority. There's other ways it could be approached, but if you want to be most expeditious, I think you would go straight to an up or down vote on each one without accepting any amendments and just see if there's enough common understanding or willingness to proceed as written.
Okay.
I do believe procedurally Judy is correct. There was one friendly amendment made and accepted. This
So she either
highlighted
has
one
to
has
withdraw
not been
it or-
accepted, so
Yeah.
I can track back if that's not going to happen.
On procedurally then, with the friendly amendment that's out here and with then Michael's adjustment, would Adam have to accept both and we just vote on it?
The first was already accepted. This one has not been, so I'll just go back and or unless it will be accepted, and then you can have a vote. I think you need to resolve the amendment first.
Okay, so do you want to,
I accept it.
okay, so we'll accept it as this and take a vote on it and go from there on up, down. So these are all up, down for the remaining docs. Okay, so I'll call for the vote. All in favor of polling for topics for HAB's listening session, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So we have a unanimous, Corey? With those two amendments.
I move to accept the affordable housing experience letter for the Daily Camera.
Second?
Oh, I second.
Well, I did it for you.
Oh, I see. I thought it was second question mark. Okay.
Open for discussion, or do we just want to go right into vote?
I think I'd like to.
Yes, Judy.
I'd just like to say one thing. We initially started out with a 750-word opinion piece, and you're restricted in the Daily Camera by the number of words, and we just couldn't do it. So we went for a 300 letter, just turned things around, took the two people, much of the advice from two people who gave advice, and just shortened it down. And that's why it's now 300 words and a lot shorter, hopefully tighter.
Moving towards a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous?
I move to accept the email to providers for the affordable housing experience.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Nays?
Do we see the
Hang on,
email?
just, I have
Say again?
I had to save that
The
one.
email? Can we
Oh,
put that one
Jeff's
back up?
doing it. We're used to it. We've seen it for a year and a half now. Going to have to update Jeff's picture. All in favor of updating Jeff's favorite picture?
I can probably get one for my raft trip, for my boat trip.
I'm like, you just had a rafting trip. Okay, ready for vote? All in favor? Aye. Unanimous?
I move to accept the affordable housing experience flyer for May 22nd.
I second. All in favor? Aye. Unanimous?
I move to accept the affordable housing experience for the week ahead in the Daily Camera.
I second. All in favor? Unanimous? Unanimous for the ayes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. We have some process issues on how we want to move forward on this. So I think in our retreat, we're going to be talking about process, and there's a few things on that agenda that we should all take some time and really think about. How do we want to see this board operate and function? And we have a lot of information in front of us. How do we want to move forward with it? How do we want to prepare for it? What do we ask of each other? So when we come to these meetings, we're actually making decisions. And it's one of the things that we did on the agenda is whether, if it's informational, no decision has to be made. We're just here to listen. We're going to do, there's comments for motions that'll be put out there if a decision is necessary. And I can spend time with either one of you or both of you if you'd like to understand how we got to where we're at and potentially any of the historical for context, if you want some of that as well. Yes.
So with these documents, I read through everything, and I probably spent about 2 hours editing things and track changes, and I sent it back to Corey. What happens then? Who sees that? Who does it go to? Who adopts the changes or decides not to include them? I could have spent more time, but I didn't have any more time. That was about all the time I could give, but I would have, I do a lot of editing in my work, so.
So what we had agreed to was that we agreed to a process where it was going to go back to Corey and Adam, and they were going to converge the documents as best as they could from any edits that any of us had sent in. So I had also sent in a ton of edits, and Adam had done them, and I think you came in right after me with doing some edits as well. Yes, Jeff?
I will add that works when there are non-substantive edits. So if it's copy editing, if the meaning stays and the intent of the board doesn't appear to change, that works. If it does not, then it would have to come back to the whole board for because you cannot make substantive decisions without a proper notice to the public. So in this case, the edits hopefully I assume, were considered to be copy edits, which if you've done much editing, you know, multiple editors have different ideas. So it's a challenge, no question.
And I think we've found that too, as a board in general, when we're drafting a lot of things, that each of us has a different style about us, so it's hard to figure out how to honor styles that are very different with each other. Judy?
I think also in the minutes of the last meeting, I'm pretty sure that's when we voted at the last meeting on the procedure we wanted to follow for having the board approve things, publicity. And so that's how, that process was followed. And again, of course, the board can change that process. That's up to the discretion of the board. But the process was followed.
Okay, Adam.
Jeff, do you mind sending the board that process?
I am trying to get it right here.
What was your question?
If he could send that process that we just decided on in the last meeting to the
Right
entire
here
board,
we
so they're
go.
aware of how the publicity pieces actually are supposed to be wordsmithed and everything.
Okay, I can, you want me to send that in an email to everyone?
Yes, please.
And honestly, I don't feel like we had an issue with the process today as much as we did how they were drafted. Does that make sense? So you guys adhered to the process that we outside of the edits just got so big because the drafting didn't fit. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Adam.
My inclination is if you are very interested in how things are said, that you would get on the engagement committee and be the drafter, because me personally, I don't mind so much how the words come out so long as they do. So I'm probably going to be very amenable to whatever anyone would come up with if they were on the engagement committee.
Mm-hmm. Did you have something, Michael?
I found sometimes in communication in groups, in writing a document, if you can make a key, with relatively few words, make a bullet point, key outline, and then people agree on what those key points are, and it becomes clear, even though they might be a little, obtuse or maybe a little excessively direct. And then you can write a narrative around that once you agree on those key points. It typically makes it easier, and the writing style is really less of an issue because the key points remain in the document. And you tend to have that brevity and clarity when you write from that, rather than trying to write freehand.
And
especially when it comes to process.
And I do think it's interesting feedback that we have at least three people that were confused by the document. So that says a lot to it. Like, if we're writing and putting stuff into place that historically will be adopted by our board, and say we have 2 more new people next year, if they pick up that document and don't understand it, and we have to go back and explain context, that says a lot.
I think, and it's not easy to set the context in the part of a preamble to a document. It's not a trivial thing to pull off. It's not easy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else to wrap that piece up? I feel bad with you all the way back here because I'm. Okay, so,
Mason?
yes, Jeff.
If I may, do you have an agreed-upon plan for how the listening session will go? Has the group delegated that to the agenda committee? I don't recall if there was a proposal that you all agreed to. Judy, you remember where we
Was
are?
at the previous meeting, that was one of the things we submitted at the previous meeting.
Okay.
And it
Must have
starts,
been a
I
good
mean,
vacation. I'm not remembering.
yeah, no, it starts with a staff, a brief staff presentation, then a provider of services, then a resident, and then we'd open it up, and
Okay.
I thought we had it, didn't we?
I don't see it in here, but
Approve the plan for educational format sessions that follows. I think that covers it right there.
how come that's not on my,
It was from last month's minutes.
I'm holding it.
Oh.
I'm holding it right here. Oh, yeah. Another blonde moment.
Okay, thank you, Judy.
Yes, Judy.
Are we actually on the unfinished business about the rescheduled retreat?
I was letting a pregnant pause happen, so if anybody had anything else they needed to feel through before we moved forward. Okay. So we'll move on to unfinished business, the rescheduled retreat.
I know there were a couple questions about the location, so I'm going to hand it off to Corey for that. And then I wondered if you wanted we assumed that you were sticking to the agenda, but last chance to change it, basically. If there's anything that came up tonight, or since you had a chance to talk with the facilitator, this would be your chance to change it.
So the location, sorry, let me pull up the address.
Jeff, while she's pulling up the address, can you just, do you have it accessible, the agenda for the retreat?
I do.
Thank you.
So it's at the Diagonal Court Community Room. The address is 3265 30th Street, number 7. It's inside of the parking lot where the old Walmart used to be, over on
Do you enter
30th.
in through the Walmart?
You can drive in off of 28th Street. If you pull in, do you know where the
just
the
looking for
farm is?
The door, yeah.
It's in that big parking lot. That's called the Diagonal Plaza. And so if you go in there, do you know where the DMV is in that little plaza? It's in one of the suites in that hallway. It's number 7.
Oh,
So there should be plenty of parking. She gave me these instructions
the
for
RVs.
parking because I don't know if the parking is limited
It's not.
in other areas. So
It's
as
fine.
long, I just recommend getting there a little bit early to find your way, find a parking spot, and then we can get settled in since it's a new space for us all.
Just no overnight parking, right?
Right, and
Okay.
no vans, no buses.
Okay. We good?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So we've got the agenda up. This is the agenda for the retreat. Get to know each other, our mission, our interactions. Is it just those 3? Communicating guidelines, ground rules, how to success.
So the HAB charter I've heard to referred to quite a bit, and is that just the verbiage that's on the Housing Advisory Board home landing page on the website? Was there a formal document somewhere? I looked for it and I couldn't find it, but
I assume this is a reference to the ordinance that council passed establishing the Housing Advisory Board. The purpose and functions are word for word, but the ordinance is a little broader than that, but that's the core of it. I think the October discussion that council had about HAB's role is although not part of that document, also a valuable way to understand what council's desires are for your work. And I can send you a link to that. It was about 30-minute discussion, if I remember right.
So the ordinance is, it says charter up there, and you're saying that refers to the ordinance?
I did not draft this agenda. I'm not sure if there's anything anyone else had in mind. That's the only thing I can think of. That's the document that created you, so
Where would I find that?
we'll provide it. Yeah, I think it was.
I have one too.
Thank you, John.
At one point, there had been discussion of you having a bunch of procedural discussions at the retreat. I believe the facilitator's judgment was, having talked to folks, that there was plenty of other harder to deal with topics, or harder is the wrong word, more meaty topics than kind of sausage making. So I think that's what the judgment was around proposing this agenda.
Yes, Jack.
Just a quick question. Did the agenda committee didn't put this together clearly, right?
No,
The
it was
facilitator did.
there's two facilitators, and we specifically have two facilitators in case going forward in the future, if one's unavailable and we want them, the other one, so that we're doing foundational work with two of them at the same time so that they could trade off for any events we may have in the future. And then they had come up with kind of a list of things, but then they talked with everybody, and this is what they came up with.
Another question. Terry and Julietta, did you have a chance to talk to them also? You did?
I spoke with
With the facilitator? Yeah.
I did.
Okay.
Mediator.
She did.
Any other questions?
Karen, right? Karen Armstrong, yes.
Jacques?
Are we being asked for any input for this agenda and how it was put together, or suggested changes?
You mean right now? Is there anything you felt like you expressed to her that you are now wanting to change?
No. It's
Okay.
more just structurally how these things are organized.
Okay.
As I'm looking at it, some of them seem to be.
Jeff?
I only put this on because of the rescheduling.
Yeah.
My assumption was that it was fine.
Yes.
I would suggest that unless somebody has some serious reservations, that, given especially that the facilitator isn't here to explain the rationale, if there were some, this was the last chance to do anything about it, essentially.
Yeah.
And with two new members joining and it being a public meeting, when the agenda otherwise wouldn't be in front of the public, maybe maybe we should have just run with it, but.
Yep. And I guess my only request in this, because we only have 3.5 hours with them over there, that it also be something that I sat down with it and literally wrote stuff under each one of them so that I was prepared and to contribute. So I would just request that you really think it through so that we can have some good, strong, meaty discussions if so desired. Anybody else? Okay, new business. And I'm assuming this is from you guys, Adam, engagement, proposed topics. Do you want to explain?
So I think this might just be a duplication because we just laid out the entire process for you there, and it doesn't involve talking about them tonight, so.
So we're just passing on this one?
Yes.
Okay. The next one is a biannual letter and a decision, and I'm making a motion to adopt a biannual letter.
Seconded.
and we'll open it for discussion. I'll give a little context of what we were talking about here. We discussed so we do an annual letter right now to City Council, and within it, we've agreed to put 2 topics that we feel like are something that we are either requesting a nod from City Council to work on and put on our work plan, or are requesting them to consider for their work plan. And since so many things are moving quickly within the housing realm for City Council, we thought that it would be something we could consider doing biannually. So June would be when we would do a second letter to them of any things that we've sussed out in the first 6 months of the year that, again, we'd want to nod to on the second half of the work plan, or we would want them to consider as something they could address, because we're seeing how fast things flip, like with Alpine Balsam and other things. So that's the framework behind a second biannual letter. Jeff, did you have something? Is that why your hand was halfway up?
Well, I would just share that the October discussion with council explicitly talked about this. Most boards and commissions do not provide, they are provided the opportunity in December to provide an annual letter to council. At that October discussion, there was a definite openness by council to receive a second letter from the Housing Advisory Board mid-year. In large part, as I remember that discussion, it was to basically put ideas on the table to say, is this okay, council? We're interested in exploring this as a way of trying to touch base on the acceptability of some ideas for work that you might do as a board.
And I'm bringing this now because if we do adopt this, then we're going to want to get rolling on a discussion in May for whatever we'd want to put out in June. So that's now. Yes, Michael.
I just offer, I think when you say biannual, what we really mean is semi-annual. Biannual meaning every other year, like every 2 years.
Oh, got it.
I don't think we.
I was, my pedantic side looked it up. There's biennial, biannual, and semi-annual. Biannual and semi-annual are the same thing, twice a year. Biennial with an E is every 2 years.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Sorry, it's just the way my brain works. So it could be semi-annual or biannual if you want it twice a year. Or you could just say twice a year letter.
Twice a year.
Which no one is confused about.
Right, for just the brevity of communication and the focus on that this evening, why don't we just say twice a year?
Great. I adopt or I accept that friendly amendment. Anybody else? Yes, Judy?
So now we're discussing the motion, right? I'm definitely in favor of doing 2 a year and doing one June, July, whenever that works out. And I recall there was full board enthusiasm for doing that. I don't recall that the format of it was decided in stone, or that we've decided to talk about 2 topics we cared about. That's what we did last letter, and I think that's still open. We might just put 3 or 4 topics of things we've heard from the public, and that's, I don't think that part is set yet. So right now, we're just voting on doing it, and that's fine, but I don't want to feel that we've already pre-agreed to what the content's going to be about.
Jacques?
Thank you. I suppose if we do, and maybe this is evidence, but if we do adopt the 2 letters a year, I'm avoiding biannual, that I almost feel like we may want to make it an optional condition. In other words, I don't want us to force ourselves into putting a letter out if we don't feel it's necessary, right? So just however it's structured. I could see some years we feel like it's valuable to do that, and maybe other years we think it's not valuable to do it. So I don't know, maybe that just is in the nature of this, but that it'll be something that we would address every year. And just at some point, probably around this time of the year, we'd say, do we want to do this letter this year? Do we feel like there are topics or items that we want to bring to council's attention in mid-year?
Okay.
So I don't know how that works, and I mean,
Well, the motion that's on the table is a twice a year, so I hear you on that, and we'll just vote accordingly. But like anything, I think we've already agreed as a board that if it doesn't work or if we need to do something, then we'd vote on it at that time. Michael, do you feel like you need to say something?
I thought that made a lot of sense.
Okay.
In the same way, we don't necessarily have to have a meeting every month. Right. If there's nothing to do, then you don't have to have one every month. Very sensible.
Anybody else want to comment?
The only comment I would add is if we're voting on whether or not a second letter happens, and we have to vote on that, if the content is undecided, then when it comes time to write a second letter, if that were approved, then we would say we have nothing to report at this time. Work is in progress. Yeah. Just.
Corey, do you have the motion language?
Yes. So
This
the motion
motion?
would be adopting twice annual letter.
So what I have is Moyer motion to adopt biannual letter, Sweatlick seconded, Mackenzie proposed amendment to clarify biannual to mean twice a year, Moyer accepted, that's where we are.
Yep. Everybody ready for a vote? And to be clear, it isn't about content or process of selecting topics, which I don't mind putting something together for our next meeting to help decide on how we'll go about selecting topics and potential topics. Does that make sense? Collecting potential topics. Yes.
is there any rationale to add a specific date to this? Just if anybody thinks about it. In other words, we don't have a definite, I mean, I think are all making an assumption that this is in June, right? And should we just add that date to this to say that it would be a June letter, or should we leave that open so that we can decide to make it at any point in the year?
Any thoughts on that, Jeff? Going that formal?
I'd leave it open. If it takes you
2 months to
3-4
draft it
months
then?
to land on it, then you haven't
Some
committed.
flexibility.
You don't have to change it. I don't see a need.
So we could push it off, but yeah, we don't need to stick to it. Okay, that was just, it was mentioned.
Because if we say June, then
at
we'd
one
have to,
point.
we'd want to,
But
that's a
we'll
good
leave
point.
it as
And
is.
just as a point of clarification, any communications to council have to be approved by a majority vote of the board. So that would be a separate vote than what you're doing right now, the actual communication itself.
Awesome. Okay, all in favor? Aye.
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 Unanimous? Thank you. So then, everybody received a copy that would have been on our desk because it came out later today about officer election procedure. And this is something that we had a basic draft from Jeff, and then Adam and I gave our opinions on it with the agenda committee. Jeff, do you just want to walk through it quick?
Sure, and again, my apologies, we failed to get this in the packet, and we should have, so. What I've done, the first part is just quotations from your bylaws, which were adopted last year, saying what's the chair's responsibility, what's the vice chair, and together they comprise the agenda committee that set meeting agendas. Then the bylaws also talk, this is the language, exact language from the bylaws about how you elect your officers. You'll see it doesn't have a direct, procedural approach. It just says majority of the board go ahead and do it. So what we drafted was to, for your consideration, was first, a supermajority must be present, so that if it's just a quorum of 4, you aren't electing your officers. That there be a determination of who's interested with the requirement for a second. So at least 2 people have to be in support of a nomination for it to be considered. Some brief communications, rationales, supports, or other comments, followed by an election procedure, number 4, with requirement that 4 votes are necessary to be elected to an officer position. So a majority of the board, and then a variety of ways of if the initial election doesn't do the job, how to get to a final decision. You'll see in this highlighted portions on the screen and in brackets, a choice. I don't know if you want to give preference. We didn't know if you wanted to give preference to people who have already served or who haven't, and if they've been on longer or more recently. So that would be something to clarify before you adopt this procedure. So that's essentially what we tried to put together.
And a little context on that, the reason why that gets a little lengthy towards the end is that we don't end up with just a flipping of the coin, which is possible. I can't remember was it council that finished the flipping with the coins? So,
Correct, yes.
yeah, so
Thank you.
the reason why we kind of funneled down on this is so that we can avoid a flip of the coin.
There it is. I move to adopt the officer election procedure.
A second. Any discussion? All in favor? Yes.
May I? There, at the moment, the way it's written, there's conflicting, the highlighted areas are conflicting. So that
you
should be
needed-
resolved before it's adopted.
If nominees have served the same time the nominee who...
Essentially, if you haven't, through a sequence of votes, been able to decide the tie-breaking procedure, first, if you've been on the board longer, you go ahead. You know, if there's 2, 3 vote recipients, whoever's been on the board longer becomes the officer. If they've served the same amount of time, this is something that we did not resolve, was you got to pick, is the person who has served before preferential or the person who hasn't? That's essentially what that is. And then if they have both served as officers, then it goes into more specificity, the officer position that's being elected.
So let's do all the way up for has served longer, and so in other words, just 1 vote for we're going to go with longer on those, and 1 vote if we're going to go with shorter term. Does that make sense for all 3? Because they're all about who's been on the board and who hasn't.
Well, the first one, unless you want to change it, just says if you're on the board longer, you win the election. That's the tiebreaker. If 2 people have each served for 3 years and they're tied in votes, who do you want to become the officer? The person who has never served as an officer or the person who has served as an officer?
That's what I'm saying. Your 3 highlighted ones are served or not served. Has not,
Yes.
or has not, or has
Yes.
longest, most recently.
So if someone had been the vice chair and now they're they're tied in a vote for the chair, do you want them to be, you want the tiebreaker to be, you already served as vice chair, therefore we want you to be chair, or you already had your chance, we want to get somebody new in?
Mm-hmm. Adam?
Not that this matters now because we have a almost entire half new board, but originally the intent was that people who hadn't served would be serving sort of as an overruling of someone who previously served, just so people get the experience of serving as an officer on the board. That's what we first established when the board was founded.
It's almost our form of term limits, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Perhaps to resolve this, you could make a motion, and if that carries, then it's done.
Okay, I'll make a motion that for all of these that are undecided, we go with the has rather than has not. I'm just saying that to get a position going.
So if you have
That would be-
two people up for election,
The highlight, the in parentheses, that we go with what's in parentheses on all three of those.
the more experienced person gets it.
They serve more, yes, yeah, yeah. Because it's either one or the other. Those three go together and the others don't, so we'll see how the vote goes. I mean, someone cannot second it, and it can go the other way, I don't care.
You had said was the original intent was it has not.
What she said is the opposite of that.
That's why, yeah, so we could not second it
Right,
and
And then
then
make
go
the-
right into the next motion.
Right.
Which would be,
I just wanted to get it moving here.
Yep.
I'm going to
You know, some parts of Robert's Rules of Order say that once you have discussion, there's a constructive second. It's still a discussion.
Well, he just seconded it, so.
oh, you seconded it?
Yes.
Okay. All in favor? 3 yeas. Juliet, Judy, Jock.
Oh, how about that?
Were you a yea? Okay.
Okay, so you need to complete the vote, I believe.
And all the nays? 4. Michael, Adam, Terry, myself. So it doesn't pass. You want to make the other motion?
Sure. I move to accept the non-bracketed versions of the tiebreaker.
All in favor? So we have 5 this time: Juliet, Terry, Mason, Michael, Adam. And the nays, Jock and Judy. So the yeses have it. And the motion, that has been adopted. Yep.
And now, do we need to vote on the original motion, or?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And did you present that original motion, or did
I presented it, and it was seconded, and then
Okay.
there was discussion, so we can go to a vote now.
Can you restate it?
Sure. I move to accept the officer election procedure as amended.
As amended. All in favor? Unanimous? Okay, that was fun. And the next decision is elect chair and vice chair.
I'd like to make a motion to postpone that vote until the next meeting, since we haven't had our retreat and we haven't had a chance to all get to know each other.
I'll second it. Yep, Michael seconded it.
I did say that first time. I'll second.
So there's 3 seconds on that. So all in favor? We've got, I can't count, 6
Procedural point that,
to discuss.
yes.
Do you need to discuss, Judy? No. Okay. So 6, it's everybody but Judy, and the nay would be Judy.
Can I get a point of clarification? Would that be new business, or would that go under unfinished?
I would say it'd be unfinished because we touched it this time, so it'd be unfinished business May 24th.
And just quick, I should have made this point earlier. Your next meeting actually is your retreat. I believe the intent was your next business meeting for May
Yes.
22nd.
22nd. I thought it was
Okay.
24th. So it's May 22nd.
Yep. All righty.
Okay, anything from the staff?
Yes, just awaiting me on my return among the hundreds of emails was a request to check in with you on the interest in participating in some way in the Transportation Master Plan update. So the city has several master plans that are typically run for 5 years or so that try and establish the priorities for, in this case, resource allocation, and they go through extensive public process. As a new board, you will likely get multiple requests for things that may or may not be directly related to housing, but certainly have an indirect connection. Transportation is certainly one of them. Environmental might be another. There could be a variety of others. But in this case, one of the things that's inextricably linked with transportation is where people live, the transportation strategies, goals, and programs could be something that you would want to consider and provide input on or not. So I'm said that we had the opportunity to check in on it. The timeline is the next 5 months. So it would be adding, if you wanted to either have a presentation on it, we would have to get it in fairly soon, particularly if that meant you would want to have some influence. There are a couple of paths that are possibilities. There's consideration of having a joint board meeting like Alpine Balsam, like some of the other projects that you've heard about. So that's a possibility, but not a guarantee. The staff, the other option would be to schedule some time at one of your meetings, either for just an overview or potentially going straight to reacting and providing input to the master plan as it will be going to council later this year. Or you could say, at this point our hands are full, or we don't see the linkages as being that important. Thanks, but no thanks. So we wanted to put it on the table and see what your thoughts were initially. We have a little bit of time to sort it out, but if there's a clear interest or non-interest, that would help the planners on the Transportation Master Plan plan their outreach and engagement.
Okay, so might I suggest, just for expediency, that we take 2 minutes, go around. You can say whether or not you're interested in yes or no, you're interested in it, and then whether or not you would like to be on a committee or have it be presented to the board as a whole. You were saying a brief, and then that way we could offer feedback based on a board. Does that make sense? You want to start, Adam?
Sure. I'm a yes. I'm interested in contributing in some way, and I think probably the easiest way would be for some of us, if not however many can go, to go to a Transportation Advisory Board meeting and have a joint session at that meeting.
Definitely interested. I think that I would be interested in having an informational, or somehow having Transportation Board provide us with an overview or an informational, kind of fill in first of where they stand, what they're looking at particularly, and look for some of those linkages. And then beyond that, I think what Adam is suggesting would be a good way to engage with it.
Michael?
I'm interested.
Mm-hmm. Judy?
Ditto. Ditto.
I'm also interested, and one of the things that popped in my mind from our presentation tonight is that the statistic that a lot of people felt that it was important to live in Boulder, and we don't know why they feel that it's important. Is it because they have poor transportation options, or traffic is really bad commuting in, and with the better transportation options, would their problems ease up a little bit, and that that number shift a little? Mm-hmm. So I'm interested.
And I would say, yes, I'm interested. I would love some form of an informational meeting here, and then potentially across board like we did with Alpine Balsam.
Yes, interested.
Does that feel clear enough for you, Jeff, moving forward, or would you like more of a?
Yes, no, that was clear interest, and as soon as they decide, well, the agenda committee will have to, whoever ends up on the agenda committee will have to decide where to program it based on the constraints of the project.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you. Anything else from staff? Okay. So we always spend the last like 10 minutes just debriefing. If there's any, it's a great time to clear the air if you're frustrated about anything or if you would like something, just to voice anything. So just opening it up for debrief. Or like Jacques, you could just sigh and that says it all. I go, no, no. Well, I think it's great having a larger board, and it's interesting integrating, especially since we're also so new and figuring out the process. So we always get slightly tense around this process thing, and it's an interesting thing, especially chairing it, to try and find a way where the people that are moving something through are honored, and those of us that are just feeling frustrated about how it's formed. But I think we get better at it, but it's also knowing that we're still in process and learning. Adam?
I'm hoping that someone would be interested in maybe being on a committee, just because I think it's worth seeing what the other side is like, having to, present this stuff to the board. And I value everyone's opinion. I think that's pretty obvious at this point, but it's hard. Like, it's hard to get it to where everyone can agree. And I hope we can continue working towards that, because I like it when people like the things we do. So.
And I appreciate that you take it when I'm cursing. Anybody else? Jeff, you want to debrief with us? Good.
The second part of this calendar check, and we already know there are a couple absences for some of the summer meetings, so given the need to schedule a larger group, if you could please take a look at your calendars and email Corey if you know already that you can't make any meetings or if you are tentative for any of them. Mm-hmm. If you have a quorum problem, obviously you won't be meeting. If you have 2 or 3 people gone, that's something you would probably want to know and decide whether to continue with that meeting or reschedule it.
And I also think, not that any of us have exercised it, but I think to be aware of the fact, isn't it missing 3 or 4 meetings before you can be called to be replaced?
If I'll have to look, I think it's unexplained, unexcused. Mm-hmm. It's not just, you were sick once, you had to take care of your kid another one, and you had to work a third.
And the only reason I looked at this is because, I wanted to hike the PCT, and I'm on this for 5 years. So I don't think it's unexplained, and I think even legitimately, because I remember I was trying to add up how many I'd be gone for, but it's
I have the bylaws here. Let's just get this resolved so everybody knows.
I was like, how many would I be missing on that one? So,
It's unexcused.
That?
It's unexplained or unexcused. I believe it's 3.
PCT.
In the event that a regular member is unable to attend a meeting or meetings, no substitute regular member shall be appointed. In the event that the chair or vice chair has knowledge that a regular member will be temporarily unable to act for 3 or more consecutive meetings owing to absence from the city, illness, interest, or other cause, the chair may appoint a replacement.
Yeah, so it's
to take the absent regular member's place during the temporary absence. Mm-hmm. That's not removal, though. Mm-hmm.
So there's a mechanism for the PCT. That's pretty cool.
It looks like it. You can get, it may be in the overall ordinance.
I'm sure after this one, nobody's going to want me to do it anyway.
I'll look it up.
On a debrief, a couple weeks ago, I was in Jackson Hole, met with a member from the Housing Advisory Board there. It's a 3-member board, and the head of their housing authority. And the reason I bring it up is, unprompted, April Norton is the woman that runs this, said, gee, we really have a great respect here for Boulder, and we borrowed some of your best practices, specifically the livability standards that they borrowed. And I bring it up because we oftentimes hear, expressions of frustration of getting things done here and things. But I understand from a brief conversation I had with Kurt Fernhaber that he said, stuff like that comes up a lot, that people borrow what we do in Boulder for other communities. And I thought, it's really great to hear that. I just wanted to share that piece of uplifting, at least for me, it was uplifting news.
No pressure. That is great. I would love to invite other housing boards in if they're ever around, or somebody's, as like a guest too, if they're ever around when we're doing something. It'd be awesome. Okay. And motion to adjourn. Fantastic. All in favor? Aye. Unanimous. Nighty the patiti.
Live from Paris, en France 24.